Hello everyone, welcome back to another stream. Hope you're doing well. Alright. I think I need to readjust my display for the chat because like the messages are getting cut off. It's annoying. It's been like that a couple nights and I just keep forgetting to fix it. Anyway, hope you're all doing well. Mercy, Methodosuri, Clownscum, 2-Hit, nice to see all of you again. Yesterday we watched a couple videos about the lore of the rest of Grand Sax bamboozling everyone in the lands between. Then we did the Empyrean's deep dive by a human Justicar. Then Who was the Snow Witch with Kite Tails. And that was pretty much the entire stream. It was surprisingly took up more time than I anticipated for these videos. We ended slightly early, but you know, sometimes that happens. So today I thought we'd start off with something a little bit different with the difficulty paradox by Semi-Ramblomatic, and then the next one will be difficulty is weird by excuse me, by Rasputin. Then we have the fate of the Forlorn by Honored Madman, and depending on time, the irony of Gideon the All-Knowing, and or why does Dark Souls sound like Dark Souls by Miss Chalice and 8-Bit Music Theory, respectively. So, that's kind of what's on tap for tonight. Hope you all are doing well. How's the world's blurriest dog doing? He's doing okay. I mean, the thing about like the epilepsy and the seizures is he's fine until he's not. It's only happened twice, so we got the lab work back and it says that there were like no other problems that they could find, so that's good news. But if it's epilepsy, it's still not like the best of news. At least it's treatable, but like the medications that we could put him on might not be the best for his kidneys long term. So after he's on like I forget the name of it, like fentanyl barbital, something like that, we'll need to take him in like a month later and see how his blood work is. And so I don't want to have to medicate the little guy, but I mean, I also don't want him to have seizures. So it just kind of sucks, you know? But thanks for asking. Is Grand Saxing a thing now? Yeah, definitely. All right. Okay, so what was the first video again? All right, The Difficulty Paradox by Semi-Ramblomatic. All right, so yeah, difficulty in gaming has been a bit of a hot topic over the past couple years, especially after like the release of Sekiro. And Elden Ring has had like its own discourse about it, but with the inclusion of things like Spirit Ashes, it wasn't nearly as bad as the Sekiro stuff because you could also just outlevel everything. All right, so here we go, The Difficulty Paradox by Semi-Ramblomatic.
I was recently struck by an intriguing game design dilemma I'd like to discuss with you all. It's a deceptively simple question, and yet, like an erection in tight latex underpants, the more you think about it, the stickier it gets.
So this is the channel Zero Punctuation made after a bunch of them quit. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't think I really knew that. Maybe, I mean, this video was suggested to me, I think, or maybe I saw it and thought it looked interesting. It's been so long. So, yeah. I think I do have one video left on the playlist by the Escapists, so it's kind of interesting to see, to like look back at everything, and so I'm really curious how that one's going to turn out. So thanks for letting me know that.
Question: should a game get easier or harder as you go through it? At first shake, the answer seemed obvious. It should get harder, surely. That's what a difficulty curve is. This is Game Design 101. You take it easy on the player at first while they get to grips with everything, and gradually ramp things up, culminating in challenging boss fights that are like final exams for all the skills the player has been developing this whole time. But I was given pause for thought when an argument broke out in Discord in response to my Assassin's Creed ZP. I'd complained that the various abilities you acquire through the course of that game, from skill trees and crafted upgrades and such like, have the effect of making things way too easy by the end, especially that one super attack where you highlight 4 or 5 guys and auto-stab the lot of them in one go, like you're deleting.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of common for a lot of games where I feel like the more difficult portions are when you're still essentially trying to figure things out, and then later on it becomes easier as you become more acquainted with the various systems in the game. And there are like degrees of like how that can work, whether or not it's meta knowledge which really influences things. So what I mean by that is like meta knowledge is having a person who's played through uh Dark Souls 1, like 10, 20 times and does speed runs, and having them start the game at level 1 versus somebody who you're putting the controller into their hands for the very first time. So while the difficulty of the game itself remains static, just like the knowledge of the game itself really can influence things, and that isn't as big a factor in I don't know, like turn-based RPGs. I mean, it is a factor, but it's less so just because like the way that the games are designed. Turn-based combat isn't going to be as influenced by that kind of thing. I mean, it is, but just not to the same degree. What would be like a better example? Maybe something like more procedurally generated. I don't know. I was gonna say like Rogue Legacy, but I mean, there's a component of skill to that. Either way, I think you guys are starting to get what I'm saying. I hope. Hey Mortis, welcome back to the stream, and Scowleasy. Havel DeBonk, welcome back. So difficult games mean so much to you. It let you process failure and learn what you needed so badly in your younger life. Bloodborne basically was a father to you in this way. Yeah, so I was well averse in getting my ass handed to me in games by playing chess as a youth. So I learned a lot of patience from that game, as well as more like strategery to deal with problems as they arose and things like that. So yeah, um, Dark Souls, they weren't like too frustrating. Like I have like quit a couple times when I got to like Ornstein and Smo after the parapet jerks. I was not having the best of times then, so I just stopped because I needed a bit of a break. But yeah, so I think the other game that really influenced me, probably similarly to you in like learning to grow a bit more, was as much as I regret to say it, League of Legends, because it made me come to the meta realization that getting angry, and not that I ever got like super angry except for like a couple of handful of times when things were literally beyond my control. um Getting angry and or seeing other people like flame the teammates or like like complain about how they were playing, I realized never had the effect of suddenly making those teammates play better. So that was just kind of like a wake up call that like if you're angry, taking it out on others just isn't the play, even if like it feels good to vent about it. Like ultimately you're just kind of setting yourself up for sabotage. And there have been times where I've actively supported the self sabotage of the enemy team by making them continue to like type in chat. So um, I didn't ever do that like a ton, but I mean, if somebody was kind of already tilted, I would just kind of go along with it by making like quick one word replies to just like keep them busy, because if they're typing they're certainly not playing the game as effectively as they could be otherwise. And so that's like another bit of like meta knowledge from League of Legends. But ultimately like the real lesson that I learned from like League of Legends was I didn't really like competitive gameplay because it was never really as fulfilling as I wanted it to be, and there was just like too much pressure for like not enough reward. So I tend to like shy away from like actual competitive games, at least for something that requires like a crap ton of actions per minute, like League. Outrage farming has gotten popular the last couple years. I mean, it's been popular for a long time, but it's certainly grown. And there's like different levels to like rage bait farming now. It's kind of mind blowing. Like the DIY type subreddit stuff where like people make fake furniture and fake inventions that just like piss people off, or like making really gross or unique food, or like wasting food for things. Like yeah, it's oh man, just like the levels that people can farm content is just kind of like mind-boggling to me. Non-binary Ava, welcome back into the stream. Okay, so enough of a segue. I'm gonna back up a little bit so that way he could like make his point because I kind of went off topic for a decent amount. Oh yeah, difficulty in games. That's what we're talking about.
Easier or harder as you go through it? At first, and yet, like an erection in tight latex underpants, the more you think about it, the stickier it gets. Question: should a game get easier or harder as you go through it? At first shake, the answer seemed obvious. It should get harder, surely. That's what a difficulty curve is. This is game design 101. You take it easy on the player at first while they get to grips with everything, and gradually ramp things up, culminating in challenging boss fights that are like final exams for all the skills the player has been developing this whole time. But I was given pause for thought when an argument broke out in Discord in response to my Assassin's Creed ZP. I'd complained that the various abilities you acquire through the course of that game, from skill trees and crafted upgrades and such like, have the effect of making things way too easy by the end, especially that one super attack where you highlight 4 or 5 guys and auto-stab the lot of them in one go, like you're deleting a group of icons off your desktop. But the comment that sparked the debate argued that surely the player is supposed to get more powerful as they proceed through the game. That's what the whole concept of leveling up is about in any game with RPG elements. You reward the player for their effort by making them stronger and giving them the chance to turn the tables on the level 1 goblins that bullied them at the start. And this was the dilemma that stuck.
So yeah, as he's going through these examples, I'm just trying to think of as many different kind of examples of where it goes right and like kind of where it goes wrong, or like the inverse of, the Assassin's Creed experience. And so for me, I would say a good example of a game that's way more difficult at the beginning of it than later on is a game like Persona, or like the original Shin Megami Tensei series. Not necessarily because like the systems are too unwieldy, but because you're effectively nerfed so much in the beginning, and as you progress and like get certain skills, you become a hell of a lot more self-sustaining in those games. And so when I played Shin Megami Tensei 4, I did it on like the most intense difficulty, and the first 3 or 4 hours like going through Naraku to get outside of like the tutorial area, those were actually pretty rough and kind of on par with some of like the earlier series in terms of difficulty. But once I got the skill that I needed to more or less just steal mana from the enemy, it kind of trivialized the entire game, and I didn't really have any more problems after that. And so the difficulty was very, very much front loaded, despite like me playing on the most difficult difficulty of the game. And so that's one example. I had some other examples, but I'm kind of like blanking right now. Hey, you 2424, nice to see you again. It's been a minute. Scaleezy says, games should get easier even with a difficulty curve, in your opinion. Based on how much mastery the player acquires as they play, curves should just make it a smoother experience. So I think a really good game, a good example of a game with a very even difficulty curve would be Super Metroid. I haven't played Metroid Dread, but those games are kind of master classes in giving the players enough upgrades to kind of, go forward, and you have to backtrack and really eventually learn how to like tie everything together to ultimately progress. Alfarius, welcome back to the stream. It's not too bad. How about yourself? My cold is kind of finally breaking, but I'm still having some moments here. So yeah, Metroid I think is a really good game of like very even difficulty. Another weirdly good game as far as like the difficulty progression curve goes are like the Disgaea series of games, because while sometimes like the difficulty curves are a bit uneven depending on like what content you want to do, the way that you can kind of scale up towards the end game is just really good and grindy in like a good kind of way if you're into that kind of thing specifically. And so a game that kind of gets easier as you one game that definitely gets easier as you go along is the Mega Man series of games, because you get more and more power-ups, and those power-ups are the rock paper scissors that you need in order to defeat the enemy Mavericks. So All of these games are good for different reasons, and they kind of all have their own places. So, yeah, you do definitely have this kind of difficulty paradox that kind of goes along with that. So I'm curious to see where they go with their kind of thought experiments or lines of thought in the rest of the video here.
Stuck with me, listeners, because it seemed like there are two generally accepted game design orthodoxies here that contradict each other. A game needs to get harder, and at the same time, the player needs to get more powerful. Surely those would cancel each other out. Gosh, one wonders how we got through 40-odd years of game development without anyone noticing the contradiction. Well, not quite. If it came down to throwing one of the two out of the life raft forever, game get harder would probably win out over player get stronger, because it's the far older, more established principle. Space Invaders gets harder because the aliens get faster. The player doesn't get any better at going pew-pew. The basic abilities of Mario do not change from start to finish. Player gets stronger was more or less strictly relegated to the RPG genre. One could argue it is the sole requisite for being an RPG or a game with RPG elements, by no means a fundament of game design the way ramping up the challenge is. Modern game design, especially in AAA, seems to place a much greater emphasis on letting the player feel powerful and feel more powerful over time. I mentioned way back in my Do Games Have to Be Fun EP that modern games skew more towards catharsis than challenge. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, it's just a matter of getting the balance right. To go back to our dilemma, the fact is, yes, game get hard and player get strong do cancel each other out, and that's the idea. Because once they've been cancelled out, what's left behind is a little thing called balance. Yes, you get more powerful and learn new skills and acquire new options and solutions, and to counterpoint that, the game has to throw more and more complicated situations at you that require mastery of those solutions. And that second part is where Assassin's Creed Mirage fucks it up. It doesn't really ramp up the challenge of sneaking around enemy strongholds stabbing dudes in the back. It doesn't introduce dudes who can't be stabbed in the back or dudes who detect you better because they remembered to put their contacts in today. All Mirage tends to do, probably in service to the whole back to basics intention, is make the enemy strongholds larger. And that's not harder, that just takes longer. And sometimes it doesn't even do that. I found with the big complicated...
So this is kind of a weird thing to think about because this is very difficult for me to articulate because I just kind of have like a vague idea of what I'm trying to get at here, but not all forms of challenge are the same. And so I'm thinking of a game that is technically kind of more difficult at the very beginning and gets a hell of a lot easier as you go on up to a point, and then you kind of wipe and try to figure out where things went wrong. And that game is Vampire Survivors. So obviously, if you start a brand new version of Vampire Survivors with like nothing saved, it's going to be a lot more difficult, relatively speaking, because you have less access to power-ups. Your meta knowledge of the game can carry you quite a bit, especially, you know, for like a first playthrough. And I'm certain there are a number of players who could roll the full 30 minutes on their first run. But there's also a very good chance that RNGesus does not save them and they get got by a bat at like level 4 or something like that. But yeah, so Vampire Survivors is very interesting because it's kind of like a rogue light, I guess, because you have like soft core challenges, like you die, you lose your character, but you do get a little bit of progression that goes towards your next character, which can, you know, steadily build you up. So there is a certain sense of you just like progression to kind of overcome the difficulty. And so the more you play it, the less difficult it becomes, but it does also continue to throw certain kinds of challenges at you that seem to be a little bit different from other games, maybe like Assassin's Creed, although I haven't really played these games to have like the best idea of how to compare the two. So anyway, Two Hit says it very perfectly that tedium isn't difficulty, and that was one of the biggest problems that I had with Destiny 1 on its release. So who else just came in? Oh yeah, El Degusto, welcome back to the stream. And hey, you said, they'd argue that turn-based games are a lot harder to curve the difficulty since it mostly relies on your knowledge of mechanics, whereas action games like DMC, Devil May Cry, requires another dimension. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier, that like turn-based games, I mean, certain turn-based games can become more and more difficult because of like the things that you face, especially as you add more and more things into it. Perhaps like Baldur's Gate 3 is a good example of that. You can kind of make the game as easy or as difficult as you want. But yeah. Roguelite moment, yeah. You've been playing Vampire Survivors a lot this last week. It's a good game. I kind of want to like replay it because some more content's come out, but it's one of like the best games that you can just like pick up and play like a madman for a week and then forget it for like half a year and get that itch again and you know just have more content waiting for you. It's been the best like $5 purchase I've had in a long time. Fear and Hunger is less about growing stronger, but more about learning about the area dying and learning from your mistakes. Yeah. And so that's like another part of like Mega Man. It's a lot more difficult in the beginning because, you know, you also have that issue of level and pattern recognition. But as soon as you get more Maverick power ups, it also becomes easier. So Mortis says, roguelites are interesting. They take a genre you don't like due to a lack of perma progression and add it, but in a way that doesn't remove the good parts of roguelikes. Yeah. I really like a lot of roguelike games, but it's really hard to get quality ones, if you know what I mean, because I'm trying to think, like, I really liked Rogue Legacy. The Binding of Isaac is pretty great, although that's not really like a rogue light so much. Risk of Rain is kind of like that at times. I don't know. There's like a lot of I like a lot of like what's in that genre. Skill based versus knowledge based difficulty. Yeah, and maybe that's kind of where it comes from. And there's different applications of skill and knowledge. So Elden Ring is like a little bit of both, and it's one that I've been kind of avoiding talking about because there's so many different ways to approach Elden Ring that no two individuals are, I mean, you know, hyperbolizing here. No two individuals are really going to have like the exact same experience going into different sections of the game. I think by the time you get towards the end game, things do kind of bottleneck back towards a kind of shared similar experience between like the pseudo boss rush between Garank slash Malekith slash Godfrey slash Horlu Radigan slash Elden Beast. So that's a bit of a you know, skill check part of the game in a game that doesn't really like have a lot of those. And of course then there's Millennia, who will most likely trash most players unless they have a pretty degenerate build to begin with. Yeah, Hades is a roguelite, yeah. Yeah. Binding of Isaac is definitely roguelike. Thank you. Okay. I'm gonna back up like 10 seconds again.
Probably in service to the whole back to basics intention, is make the enemy strongholds larger. And that's not harder, that just takes longer. And sometimes it doesn't even do that. I found with the big complicated palaces, I could usually find an easy way to steamroll straight to the middle of the place, then hide in a bush and make sure no one's following. And I make no apologies for taking the easiest route available, even if other routes might hypothetically be a more stimulating challenge. My instinct is to be efficient, because I don't know what the game's going to pull out of its sleeve next. That's why whenever I play a Far Cry game, I invest in a silent sniper rifle at the earliest opportunity, because those enemy soldiers are a vicious bunch, but they never figure out not to have all the guards and alarm boxes in their compounds exposed to open air, and with line of sight on a nice roomy bush on a hill half a mile away. So the Assassin's Creed Mirage auto-stab 4 guys power particularly rubs me up the wrong way, because the game never gets challenging enough to counter it. But it also doesn't quite gel with the idea of player gets stronger, because the thing about creeping around stabbing dudes is that that's the core mechanic of the game. The suspense, the timing, the strategizing what order to take the guards out without alerting the others, that's the stuff that we're here for. A power that just auto-stabs 4 of them isn't just making the game too easy, it's flat out removing the game. As a general...
So I don't know why I didn't really think about it until this moment, but seeing the character like looking down and, you know, jumping to kill them just reminded me of Sekiro. And that's one of those games where I think it really... Man, it does a really good balance of increasing challenge and difficulty, but it's also kind of trash at it at the same time, because you'll have absolute wall insurmountable bosses until you like figure them out, and they're just really high leaps in difficulty, and then you have like amazingly crafted bosses which kind of more or less force the players to learn a certain mechanic. So I think if you have the stupid Mikiti counter, obviously the halberd dude in Hirata Estate is like one of the best like bosses you could fight, because he's slow enough and he does a similar move often enough that it's kind of like the tutorial boss for that move. But it's really awkward if you don't have that move, because then the spear dude is a real pain in the ass. Don't ask me how I know. And so, anyway, aside from like the spear guy, a lot of the mini bosses are more challenging than like full on bosses in many other games. And when I say it like that, it sounds like I'm like exaggerating a little bit, but I'm definitely not, because Sekiro's actual bosses are like the uber bosses of other games. So not all of them are like that, but I think Genichiro is probably like one of the best designed bosses, if not the best designed boss in a FromSoft game. And I kind of stand by that even through Elden Ring, just because he is like, unless you cheese him, he will be the full culmination of the player's mastery of the tutorial skill sets. And then after that point, you're kind of cruising up until you hit like, the really big walls of Ashina Ishin, or if you go down the route, Ashina Ishin, who's just, not the Sword Saint, and or like Ama and Owl. So yeah. Alferia says AC Soul, I'm not sure, of made the AI smarter. Treat the early enemies like a yokel militia, and mid and later game like you're up against proper trained soldiers who are aware of your past actions and on alert. Yeah, Genichiro is fun to fight once you get it down. I really do like a lot of Sekiro's combat, and just like how cinematic it was. I mean, I don't think you get enough credit for how absolutely cinematic just basic combat was, and just how satisfying and how rhythmic it felt. So, okay.
Rule of thumb, the best way to reward the player is to give them more gameplay. Give them money to buy new weapons or unlock a new area with more challenges. If you reward them by taking away gameplay, you're tacitly stating that your gameplay sucks and they should want to skip it. And this is by far from the first time.
So there's a lot of nuance to that, and I've played a lot of Destiny 2, where I can definitely understand where who's the creator of this? I'm so bad with the names. Where Second Wind or Semi-Ramblomatic is coming from, because taking away gameplay definitely sucks, and I do think Destiny 2 does that too much at times with like the rotating seasonal artifact mods and stuff like that. I really don't like that, which is a little bit oxymoronic, because a lot of that stuff is technically optional, but the thing is, if you're not abusing like the most meta stuff, you're losing, so they just kind of like craft a little bit of a degenerate playstyle and a little bit of a degenerate and or toxic community if you try to deviate from the meta a little bit, because their higher tier content can be a little bit tedious at times if you are not prepared for it. But if you're prepared for it, the difficulty is actually pretty good. So they really walk a thin line in trying to make their game difficult yet not tedious. And quite a bit they kind of miss that mark and just end up going into tedious, especially if you're trying to do something like solo a dungeon boss, even though the dungeons are technically designed for three players. Like, I never went back and soloed a couple dungeons just because I didn't feel like having to deal with trying to trigger 8 different boss DPS phases, because it takes so long to just trigger one DPS phase on your own. So anyway, getting a little bit on a tangent there. You're so glad you put down D2. Yeah, it's definitely been an issue since D1. I initially was not going to play Destiny 2 at all because of all the stuff that they did wrong in D1, but it was really like the word of mouth from the community that kind of turned me around to it. I don't really regret playing Destiny 2. I had fun playing it, got my money's worth, waiting for the game to get better. The thing is, like, I feel like they're taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back in a lot of ways, or I don't know. Like, there's a lot of stuff that they've done very recently, which is very good for the game, but I think it just kind of, whatever they fix, it kind of ends up revealing other issues with the game. So it kind of feels like the devs are constantly playing whack-a-mole, and when they're not doing that, it feels like they're shooting themselves in the foot making some of the stupidest decisions that players could see for coming from a mile away. So, sorry for going on this tangent so much, but I'm going to continue it ever so slightly longer by saying, for those who might not know too much about Destiny 2, right now they needed to delay the next expansion that they were doing, but right before they did that, they thought that was the perfect time, I guess, to nerf so many freaking abilities and all this other stuff. So that way, players have to experience one of the worst seasons of the game in one of the worst states of the game. So it's just so silly and short sighted the way that they did that. Whereas I think it would have been way smarter for them to just, let things linger and be slightly broken so that way players could enjoy the game a bit more intrinsically through an extended period of time rather than making it feel more like a slog when the game is in a bit of a slog due to the extended wait. And obviously, with a new expansion coming out, people are going to be more hyped about that kind of content and be more forgiving of nerfs if they feel like it's going to ultimately balance the game. So they have a lot of balancing issues that just kind of like boggles the mind. Mortis doesn't regret it either. It was a wonderful part of his life, but you're glad to be done. Yeah, I mean, I still need to like log in this weekend and get the weekly stuff that I need. Essentially, go to Zur, but yeah, I'll keep up with it for a little bit because you never know when you want to go back to it. But yeah, Alfarius also played D1 and was disappointed. Not enough content, and they purposely got rid of mild exploits to force you to grind their boring content. Yeah, D1's launch was atrocious. This is why you're glad the Borderlands games aren't live service. Yeah, yeah. Oh boy, live service. That's another whole can of worms. Hey, Astanex, welcome back into the stream. Yeah, some people had told me that apparently the new COD game, the way that they did skill-based matchmaking may have weighted some games to make players stay in the lobbies longer. So if the skill level is so even that the game becomes a stalemate, it would technically increase user engagement metrics, which is kind of a dystopian nightmare, I think. So yeah. Okay, going back to the bid.
Ubisoft has done this. The whole reason Assassin's Creed has to keep rebooting and re-examining itself is because it keeps mistaking innovation for just giving us more, easier ways to get the stabbing done, particularly in the Ezio trilogy. By the end of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, if you did all the assassin recruiting side stuff, you get the ability to wave your hand and make every guard in the vicinity instantly drop dead. And using that was like using the warp whistle in Super Mario 3. It's not making me feel more powerful, it's making me feel like I cheated myself out of gameplay. Oh, and let's not forget it was Ubisoft who at one point were trying to flog time saver passes for their games for additional microtransactions, as in you pay to not have to play as much of the game. I can't help feeling this was one of those revolutionary ideas brought in by a manager who has never played a fucking game in their lives, but got the job because they used to play golf with Yves Guillemot's tax accountant. Someone who thinks players genuinely only want to get to the ends of games rather than actually play the fucking things. Sorry, this is veering into a different rant altogether. I didn't mean to just pick on Ubisoft this whole time when I'm seeing this come up in AAA a lot lately. Any stealth game where you unlock the ability to see dudes through walls is almost always kicking the legs out from under the challenge. There's a reason why they banned wall hacking in Counter-Strike. And then there's Hogwarts Legacy and that one ability you can unlock that turns enemies into explodey barrels, which made me wonder why the Harry Potter universe authorities ever made a fuss about all that Avada Kedavra business. But anyway, to conclude my response to the Discord argument that started all this, yes, it is a prerequisite of any game that has RPG elements in even the vaguest sense that the player should get more powerful. But it is also true that the game needs to get proportionally harder if it wants to stay interesting. And there have been many big games lately that make me worry that the second part of that equation is being neglected. Think of it like you're throwing a birthday party for someone you really hate.
So yeah, I wonder if that qualifier RPG elements is doing the heavy lifting in that sentence. Because in some ways, like Vampire Survivors doesn't really get harder, but yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird, but I guess that's not like the most RPG element. I'm trying to think of a game that got better because it got easier. Um, I mean, like the Mega Man games coming to mind. Those aren't like the most traditional RPGs, but they also do have like scaling, not scaling difficulty, but like difficulty that's on par with what you're able to do. So trivializing the game and making it better somehow. I mean, that kind of I think really just comes down to the player because oh yeah, maybe like Path of Exile. Well, I guess there's still plenty of challenge there. But anyway, it comes down to the playstyle preferences of the individual because some people really can get a lot of enjoyment out of min-maxing and breaking the game and making it so that the game doesn't provide any challenge for you. So, um in some ways, if you know what you're doing, the end of Final Fantasy VII, like the whole like game can essentially become a joke once you get enough materia that you can like pretty much do whatever with it. But a lot of players aren't going to ever like really get that far, and so they can get really sideswiped by the final boss of that game. So yeah. Risk of Rain, where you get more items. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. But also Risk of Rain resets. But yeah, that's a pretty good one. Depends on the Mega Man game. Some ramp up the difficulty with the wider levels. Yeah, that's why I was like rethinking it because um it does become easy, but then like they kind of throw everything back at you so that way it becomes like a little bit of a war of attrition. So you kind of need to like master what you already had. It doesn't truly trivialize the game in the way I think they're trying to argue right here. The power gamer in you really enjoys getting as strong as possible. Yeah, you're a god by the end of DS1. Materia, try Yuffie and the Morph Materia. Oh, I know all about it. All right.
You get them in with some nice presents and decorations and get them all happy and smug on their stupid fat face, so it's all the more satisfying when you get them to the cake and wham, punchy stick trap.
Midriff, exposed shoulders, wind blowing across your nips. Cover yourself up, if you want to, with Second Wind shirts. For a reason we can't legally discuss, our artists have had a little free time, so they've come up with brand new designs for our brand new channel and mostly new shows. Fully Ramblomatic, Design Delve, Cold Take, and the Second Wind itself. It's some kind of bird. Act fast because some of these designs are only available for a limited time. We've partnered with Shark Robot to make the shopping experience as easy as possible. Because let's be honest, life is hard sometimes. One day you're happy and working, and the next day you're called into a meeting and HR is there and you're just fucked. Head to sharkrobot.com/second-wind or click on the link in the description to check out all of our shirts today. And I think there's a desk pad too. That's fun.
Yeah. Oh, that's actually the end of the video. I thought there was gonna be more. Okay. Um. So yeah, I think Dark Souls might be one of those good examples of a game that can get more fun the easier it becomes, but that's also not true. I think it becomes more fun the easier it becomes if you're on like the revenge tour mode, essentially going back and trying to style on everybody. You've graduated high school now. You're just back on campus to laugh at everybody, I guess. I don't know. So, right. Non-binary Ava says there's also accessibility to consider here, and you're not sure if this video is considering that. Probably not, but if you could elaborate a bit more, I think it'd be easier for me to understand where you're coming from, because difficulty, it should still be accessible. And so I feel like accessibility and difficulty are different topics, but there's certainly a lot of overlap between the two ideas. Yeah, it definitely was, Mortis. Scaleezy says, part of min-maxing and power gaming is engaging with the game on a deeper level and skillfully manipulating it. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a game where you just become disgustingly overpowered pretty much no matter what you do at the end that like kind of is better for it, but I'm kind of like struggling. All right, and also coughing out a lung. So it's really good that we have that second video to go through, because I feel like this wasn't enough, and I'm gonna like keep talking about this topic. So like this is a good video. I'm definitely gonna like it because it's got the brain juices flowing. It's a little bit loud, so I feel like I'm shouting in comparison. Maybe I should turn down my headphone. Skyrim? Yeah, that's actually a pretty good one. Yeah, it's kind of funny because I thought about like how different. I should just keep it playing. How different Skyrim and Oblivion were in how you could approach them. Because Oblivion was fundamentally broken because if you leveled up all of the stats that like you made your primary stats at the beginning of the game, all of the enemies would like scale to that, and you would just get absolutely trashed. Which is definitely what happened to me on my first playthrough. So I remember like going through some catacombs and I was trying to kill like this ghost leech type of thing. And it took me over like 63 arrows to finally kill the thing. Whereas most things in the, Elder Scrolls games, you're supposed to kill within like 1 to 6 attacks. So this was, anywhere from 10 to 20 times more difficult, and it was just so tedious. I was like, this can't be right. And so like I looked it up and like found out how leveling in Oblivion really worked and how I'd pretty much bricked my game. So that was kind of the inverse property of that. But Skyrim's a good one because you can definitely get to a certain level and then just pub stomp everything. And that can be good and it can be bad. Because, it's probably better just because, like, Skyrim doesn't have enough engaging gameplay to really make combat be like, oh, yeah, this is it, It's just kind of functional, I guess I could say. Not that it's, like, particularly bad, but, we're also in 2023 now, and I don't think people are looking to Skyrim as, like, a bastion of engaging combat mechanics anymore. So yeah. Captini, welcome back to the stream. Once you're God, there's no point in playing unless you want to gank everything in the game for the lulz. And that's kind of the other coin, or other side of the coin, that Second Wind or Semi-Ramblomatic was kind of getting at there. So it can be a good thing, and it can be like a bad thing as well. Yeah, Disgaia's whole shtick was becoming game-breakingly powerful. That is true. However, Disgaea at the end definitely has game-breakingly powerful bosses to give you a run for your money, no matter how long you've been grinding. So that's kind of why I don't include it, but you're not exactly wrong. And it can definitely be fun in Disgaea going through each floor of like a level and literally obliterating it with everything on the floor with like one attack, which is kind of like Path of Exile, but like Disgaea, Path of Exile in like maybe not, Diablo isn't the best example, but like Path of Exile at the least also has that kind of like super high tier content to keep things interesting. And yeah, as Ava says, and as 2Hit have been saying, it really just comes down to like, I think the player mentality of whether or not they really want to engage with those mechanics rather than it just kind of like being given to you for free. Yeah, Skyrim is more about exploration and interaction than compelling gameplay. Agreed. Yeah, I had inadvertently discovered that alchemy enchantment loop myself before like I looked anything up about it. It always makes you tired when people cry about seeing an easy mode or an accessibility option you can avoid. Yeah, a lot of people just don't really have the experience to think about it beyond themselves. So, gatekeeping just kind of sucks in general. But I'm going to do it anyway, because you guys should force your way through the gate. I'll hold it for you. Because that way you earned it. I don't know. Alright.
One of the hardest...
So this is going to be another cool video to watch. Oh yeah, I did link the last video in chat if you want to give them a like and or a sub. I'll go ahead and link it again because I don't think I like announced it. So there it is in the chat for you guys. So yeah, I definitely want to talk more about this topic. So I'm glad we have this next video, Difficulty is Weird by Rasputin, to watch now.
Decisions I find myself faced with when playing a game is this one. It's almost always the first choice you make, and it is one of the biggest deciding factors on what kind of experience you're going to have. For the longest time, it's something I never paid much mind to, always just selecting normal or whatever seemed to be its equivalent, because I figured that must be the intended experience. Like, it's literally called normal, so you'd assume the game must be best balanced around that mode. But more recently, I've realized that's not always the case. One example of this that I've touched on a bit in the past can be seen with The Witcher 3. It's normal.
Yeah, I remember Donkey kind of had a video talking about this topic, and he, I think, highlighted Halo 2 as a really good example where the menu said, like, this is the intended experience, and you're like, all right. So, you kind of know what you're going for. So, yeah. Typically, I also like to do the normal mode or, hard mode, depending on the game and or how much I feel comfortable with, like, the universe or setting or whatnot. So, I think what would be a good example, like a game like Star Ocean, you can't go into hard mode until you beat the game, which is kind of a bummer because I feel like I would do those to begin with. All of the Persona or Shin Megami Tensei games I do in hard mode first because I'm comfortable enough with both the terminology used for their spells and whatnot, as well as like just the combat mechanics in general, where it wouldn't bother me. Final Fantasy 16, I did normal mode because hard mode is, gated behind New Game Plus. And then hard mode in that game just seems to be more tedious rather than like increasing difficulty and like enemy movesets. And I think that is something that is woefully misunderstood by a lot of devs. That hard mode shouldn't just be like, oh, things are tankier or spongier. Hard mode should like have more mechanical considerations, I think, to make the gameplay more engaging compared to, normal mode or something like that. Easy mode is for the weak. Slug through like the rest of us did in previous games and learn without hand-holding. Yeah, he was being sarcastic, Mortis. Okay.
Option, Story and Swords, provides a decent challenge and certainly will be a good option for some, but I found it to be underwhelming as I was able to pretty easily beat the game without engaging with most of its systems. Aside from a few tutorial quests that forced me to use alchemy in the bestiary, I pretty much ignored them entirely, because in the time it would take me to read up on a monster's weakness and create an oil or decoction to help me take it out, I could have already killed it and been on to the next one. Using those mechanics didn't feel worth my time, which is a bummer because they're interesting systems that encourage exploring and engaging with the world and lore in meaningful ways.
That's good to know. I've never played Witcher 3. I have it because it was on sale for like $5 with like the DLC, and I was like, well, damn, that's a pretty good price, and I've heard really good things about this game. So I definitely added it to the cart way back when. So if I ever do go through it and play it, I will keep this in mind. So I'm definitely glad to learn a bit more about it.
Are an important piece of what makes The Witcher 3's gameplay loop feel so good, but as I didn't use them, I missed out on most of that, and once I finished my first playthrough, I walked away feeling bored and unimpressed. Then last year, after a handful of failed attempts of getting back into it on a higher difficulty, I finally fully dedicated myself to a Death March playthrough, and it felt like an entirely different game. All of the mechanics I once ignored became integral to my success, as certain fights were simply impossible without them. It encouraged a playstyle that pushed me to learn about the world and think carefully about every encounter, making me feel like a Witcher instead of a typical video game hero. And this made it so much more distinct from most other open world games I've played. Now, I don't think Death March fixes every issue with the game or its combat, but at the very least, it got me to approach it in a much more enjoyable way than I did the first time. The thing is, if I hadn't read up on it and been told by friends to give Death March an honest shot, I never would have known to try it. And even if I had decided to start with it unprompted, I would have changed difficulties almost immediately, because the first encounter absolutely wrecked me. Like, I died over 5 times to these stupid ghouls. On Death March, they have the capability to take you out in just a few hits, and as you don't have any notable gear or items, there are no advantages to lean on. Also, given my pretty simple experience on Story and Swords, I wasn't used to needing to dodge so frequently or wait for openings to attack, so it took me a good while to get those things down. Had this been my first playthrough, I would have made the very fair assumption that I was in over my head, as dying so many times during what is for all intents and purposes still part of the tutorial is a pretty clear sign that you should turn the difficulty down. But in reality, Death March isn't nearly as punishing as this first encounter makes it out to be. To be honest, I struggled more with this fight than any other I came across throughout my 100+ hour playthrough, and
That's really interesting and kind of, ties into the last video that we watched. Oh, about difficulty, go figure. Because when you don't have like the tools to mitigate aspects of the difficulty, it can seem a bit oppressive at times. So it's definitely good to have this kind of a perspective about this as well. And that gets me, because like watching the video of the footage of him getting his ass beat by, the little dog gremlin things makes me think that I probably shouldn't try Death March my first time through. But now with him saying like, oh, that's just because you don't really have anything to deal with that stuff, I would really need to think about whether or not I should go through that on my first time or like the difficulty slightly below this. So yeah, really intrigued where this is going so far.
The only thing that killed me more than these ghouls was gravity. My whole experience with The Witcher 3 illustrates one of the bigger issues that comes from having difficulty options. If players don't pick the right one, it can turn a game they would have otherwise really loved into one that never manages to impress them. And it all starts with having to make a guess of which setting will be right for them. If it were just about players having to assess their skill level in any given genre, that'd be hard enough. But they also have to contend with the fact that every title is balanced differently, and a hard mode in one game is not the same as a hard mode in another. Honestly, when it comes to The Witcher 3, I still don't know if the reason I like Death March so much is because I'm an above average player or because CD Projekt Red did a bad job of picking out what their default mode should be. When playing something new, the only thing I can really base my decision off of is what difficulty level I went with for other games. And even though it might get me close a lot of the time, it obviously is a flawed way to do it because it is using irrelevant information. It takes actually playing something to have any real idea, but as I already pointed out with the ghouls, even that can be misleading. An early lull or spike in difficulty can give an inaccurate depiction of what a setting will be like to play long term. The logical
Anybody know what game that was? It looks kind of interesting, and I don't think I've ever seen it before.
difficulty can give an inaccurate depiction of what a setting will be like to play long term. The logic
I kind of wish more content creators would like caption what the footage is if it's different, just because it's kind of nice to be able to like figure out what it is without having to go in the comments and be like, yo guys, what was the game at 3:55? Oh, it looks like a League of Legends game. Really interesting.
logical solution to this problem is to just switch difficulties throughout a playthrough. When things start to feel mindless, bump it up, and when it seems like you're constantly bashing your head against the wall, turn it down. But I find that this is easier said than done. For instance, I like the feeling I get from overcoming challenging games. So when I run into an obstacle that seems out of my league, a part of me always wants to figure out how to get past it. Even though I don't think I should feel this way, lowering the difficulty seems like a sort of failure. It's me giving up on the chance to enjoy the sweet satisfaction of getting good. There are times where it's obvious that I should just switch, so I do, but more often than not, I feel inclined to just keep pushing through it. To keep trying regardless of how frustrating it gets. Putting this much effort into conquering a challenge certainly can pay off, but with some titles it really only serves to hurt its general vibe and pacing. Like playing The Last of Us on the highest difficulty has its merits, but for many it will lead to getting torn apart by clickers so many times that they'll forget what Joel and Ellie are even trying to do. Getting through these encounters will probably feel satisfying to a degree, but it will come at the cost of the game's story, which I'd argue is a much more important aspect, especially during a first playthrough.
That's a very good point as well. I think that issue is kind of present in some of the FromSoft games to a degree, where there can be so much content in between content that you kind of forget what was where and why. And I think obviously Elden Ring is the worst offender for that. Whereas the other games are more self-contained, obviously. So I'm trying to think of other games where you I kind of forgot what was going on in the story or something because I was like fixated on something else. Oh yeah, no, that's definitely happened to me in Disgaea, because I like to just kind of screw around and go off and do my own thing. So I would kind of neglect to do the story stuff because it feels a bit more rewarding to go off in other directions at times. So I mean, in those types of games where I have enough freedom to do whatever I want, it's really bad because I'll never do what I need to do. And that's exactly how I approached Oblivion in Skyrim as well. Like I got to like level 80 in Skyrim and I couldn't even use any single of the dragon shouts because I never went through the main quest. I had 23 dragon shout words, couldn't use a damn one of them, and didn't even care because I was off fighting around the world. All right. All right, you guys in chat, you guys need to chill out. We're just here to have a good time. No need to get into silly arguments.
As for turning the difficulty up, I'm often resistant to do this as well because I never know what's coming up ahead. If I bump it up but then the next area is far more challenging, I may have to turn it back down again, which would feel kind of bad. Furthermore, I worry that jumping between difficulties might undermine certain moments. If a section feels especially easy or hard, there very well could be an intended and important reason for that. A pretty famous example of this sort of thing can be seen with God of War 2018 when Kratos is preparing to go to Helheim. In order
Oh yeah, and this also happened to me in Lords of the Fallen because I'm kind of a stubborn player and I like more difficulty. When I got to Pilgrim's Perch, I had the Pilgrim Perch key and I went through the door and the enemies got suddenly scaled up, but I kind of liked that added difficulty for it. And then I just kind of kept going, not really knowing that wasn't the intended jump in difficulty. Because it felt kind of like good to me, like challenging, and I liked that. And so I went all the way up to the Leprosarium before going down to like the Forsaken Fen and whatnot.
to weather the conditions of the Realm of the Dead, he has to retrieve the Blades of Chaos, weapons from his past that he hoped to keep buried. On the way to get them, he's confronted by a group of Hellwalkers, all of whom are resistant to the icy nature of the Leviathan Axe, essentially forcing the player to use Kratos' fists and shield to take them out. This leads to a pretty grueling and demanding fight, where the weapon you've come to rely on is useless. Then after getting the Blades of Chaos, Kratos is attacked by another group of Hellwalkers, and all the tension and frustration that was built up from the previous fight is immediately unleashed as Kratos slices through them with ease, demonstrating a clear increase to his power that thematically aligns with the narrative. But if you were to lower the difficulty to get through the first fight more easily and raise it during the second so it'd be more of a challenge, this sequence wouldn't be nearly as effective. Admittedly, it is unlikely that someone will change the difficulty during this section, as it isn't long enough to cause so much frustration that they'd feel the need to switch, but just knowing that games do this sort of thing always makes me wonder if I'm in the middle of a sequence that will soon have a big payoff or playing on the wrong difficulty.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never really worried too much about lowering the difficulty mid-game, and or if I have lowered the difficulty in mid-game, definitely never worried whether or not the devs intended it to be like particularly difficult, and so that way like the thing that after it would be easier. So that's kind of a weird dilemma. So it's interesting to me.
If I didn't let these mind games get in my way, changing from one difficulty to the next doesn't even guarantee that it will balance things perfectly, as there are so many different aspects of a game that can affect how easy or hard it is, and in a lot of cases, changing the difficulty will shift all of them. So if you're playing an action-adventure title on medium and feel like the puzzles are the exact right amount of challenge, but the combat seems trivial, changing it to hard may address your issues with fights, but it might come at the cost of puzzles becoming frustrating. The best way to solve this problem is by making the difficulty settings of a game highly customizable, when players are able to adjust specific aspects like how aggressive enemies.
And then the pitfall of having highly customizable difficulty sliders is not knowing what is intended, or like, you know, what the devs may have curated perhaps, unless they have like specific settings like demarcating that. But yeah, just kind of just wishful thinking at that point.
Are, or how much time they have to solve a puzzle, or the amount of experience they get from winning a fight. It makes it possible for any given player to...
I forgot about that in P4. Is that normal? Probably. Okay, anyway.
balance the game in a way that is just right.
Oh yeah, that kind of reminds me, like one of the best settings for like difficulty and stuff that I've seen in a game so far comes from Dragon Quest XI, where where you can more or less set what kind of challenge run you want to do from the very beginning of the game. I think that is such a progressive idea, and I can't wait for more devs to just completely steal that idea and implement it into their games. Like, I've been crossing my fingers and hoping that FromSoft to do that in their games for a long time, and still huffing on that copium till then.
Right for them. At least that's how it works in theory, but I found that in practice it's much more complicated than that. I do appreciate the idea of being given full control over my experience, but more often than not, having these options quickly becomes overwhelming, because when playing a game for the first time, I have no idea what settings will lead to the optimal experience, and frankly, I probably wouldn't fully know on a second playthrough either. More options may give players the capability to perfectly balance the difficulty of a game, but that doesn't mean they have the know-how to actually do it. Now, if there are just a few options to
Yeah, and that's another good point. That kind of like ties into what I was saying there a moment ago.
pick from, it probably won't be that tough to figure out what to adjust, but the fewer options there are, the more likely it'll be to run into the same issues as games that don't have any customization. When there are a wide range of options though, it can take a ton of trial and error to figure out what works best, to see how different settings interact with each other to augment the difficulty. And I think
And while that's a fantastic idea, it's also kind of shit on a consumer level, because when a person buys a game, they typically want to, play the game, not figure out how to play the game the way that they'd enjoy it, with, some exceptions of things like the games that are designed to be that way, where you're like supposed to figure it out. So things like maybe what would be a good example? Like Civilization comes to mind, or maybe like The Sims, but that's I don't know. Anyway.
For most players, putting a bunch of effort into troubleshooting a game's difficulty in the hopes of finding the right balance isn't how they want to spend their time. They're not the game designers. They don't have a good grasp of how any small change may impact their long-term enjoyment. Also, constantly modifying various aspects of a title to see what works best can create a disjointed experience, and that might make it harder to get into or appreciate a title. At the end of the day, most people just want to play video games without having to think about it. To clarify, I'm not trying to advocate that games should never include this kind of customization. Honestly, I really do like the idea of it, and I imagine there are plenty of players out there who get a lot of value from being able to make these small, specific adjustments. However, I've learned that I don't enjoy the process of figuring it out, which typically leads to me ignoring them, but still always wondering if I can make things better. In general, it's kind of nice when I am not solely in charge.
And it's kind of ironic that I keep returning to Disgaea as like one of the games that kind of fits a lot of these paradigms, but I just remembered in those games, you do have the option to raise the difficulty or lower it or raise how much like money you can get from monsters and stuff through certain actions in like a courtroom setting. So you need to have like a kind of consensus amongst monsters in your kind of world and whatnot, which is a real pain in the ass to do. So there is kind of like a bit of cost benefit analyses that needs to go into this. And so it's prohibitive enough that players wouldn't want to mess with it too much, and also not like permanent enough either, where it can like really mess with players' experiences of the game. And it does feel like inviting in a way, yet not forced. I don't know.
Of the decision when the game gives some sort of feedback of what is right for me. One approach like this is when a game puts the player through some type of measurable test in order to judge their skill. The first time I ever experienced something like this was in Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. The intro puts the player through a typical tutorial assault course, and the recommended difficulty is determined by how quickly they clear it. This seems like a great approach, as instead of making the player judge how good they are, the game itself takes a sample of their gameplay and tells them how prepared they will be for the challenges in store. sure. Of course, while this is an intriguing approach, it doesn't mean that it comes with no issues or uncertainties. For instance, judging someone on how good they are at a game when they're first getting the hang of it isn't the best sample of their actual skill. If a player runs through the course once while still figuring out the basics and doesn't give it another try, there's a chance they'll be recommended too low of a difficulty. On the other hand, if a player does what I did the first time I played COD 4 and stubbornly grind the course over and over again until they've practically memorized it and can do it fast enough to be recommended veteran, then they will almost certainly be setting themselves up for failure, as doing that doesn't actually make them good at the game. It just makes them good at that very specific challenge. The tutorial does test the player's reaction time and how well they can position themselves, but it doesn't account for other important aspects like their decision making or ability to avoid taking damage.
I wonder if certain things were weighted differently, like hitting the wooden part of the thing, of the little boards, is like worth less points than the actual picture of the target, because that would be a very, I don't know, intuitive way, I think, on the developer side to judge whether or not a person actually has like decent aim, or if they're just kind of like twitch reacting to whatever is in front of them and they're a little bit inaccurate because of that. So like, are they aiming or are they just reacting, I guess? So maybe that's a bit meta. That makes me really curious how that stuff was weighted. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea about the tutorials. I forgot all about this, and I played a lot of COD 4, so yeah. You just beat Solar Cinder using the Artorias wolf flip. Freaking epic last hit. Yeah, man, nice. God, as he's charging the Sunlight Spear, nice. Ava says, this video is good for people, but for people who want to see more about this topic and the perspective of disability, you can look up Laura K. Buzz and Game Maker's Toolkit. Thank you.
Is just one small piece of what makes a player good at the game. And this sort of approach becomes even more questionable when looking at titles that don't rely on precision or quick reflexes in the way that shooters do. Take The Witcher 2 Enhanced Edition, which came out a little under a year after the base game and added a tutorial that has Geralt fighting in an arena against various enemies and monsters. At the end of it, the player is put up against a handful of foes that get increasingly more powerful, and the more enemies they are able to kill, the higher the recommended difficulty will be. However, the arena is not really representative of how players will normally approach combat, as it mostly ignores the whole preparation aspect of the game. Also, the tutorial has no way of assessing the way in which the player kills or dies to the various enemies, which can lead to a bad recommendation. Generally, a player with a fair bit of skill is more likely to take risks, and even though they may have a grasp over the combat, as they are playing more aggressively, there is a higher chance of them making a small mistake that costs them their life. Whereas someone with less skill who plays as cautiously as possible could theoretically take out each of the enemies if they have enough patience. And due to how The Witcher 2 recommends difficulty, both players would be given settings that don't make sense for them. This can have a ton of consequences, one of the most notable being that it might condition the less skilled player to approach every encounter as conservatively as possible, which isn't how the game was really designed to be played. Of course, all these titles do still give players the option to pick whatever difficulty they want, but it's hard to go against what a game recommends, as you'd assume it has a better idea about things than you do. Even though this...
Yeah, and I think all those are pretty strong and compelling points. Yeah, because if somebody's running away constantly, they would probably be better off on an easier difficulty. Yeah, I definitely see the sense in that.
Approach is cool, it clearly is not the most effective way to determine player skill, and I think the fact that more games don't use it is proof of that. The reality is, with most titles, there just isn't a good way to measure a player's skill quickly. Frankly, one of the most important things a player can have is game knowledge, which is a hard thing to test for, especially in a tutorial. And that's why assessing a player's skill for a longer amount of time and further into a game leads to better results. The way this is typically done is by dynamically shifting the difficulty based on how well or poorly the player is doing. Most games have this to a degree, although we don't always think of it as a difficulty modifier. For example, a lot of titles will drop more health or ammo when you're low on one or the other. While it's easy to just see this as common sense and not something tied to difficulty, if a player is constantly out of ammo, there's a good chance it's partially because they are inaccurate with their shots. And if they're always low on health, it most likely means they're taking hits they don't need to. So being given these things as a result essentially makes things easier for them. It's a small adjustment that doesn't shift the core gameplay, but it does balance balance things out for those who aren't as skilled. There are, of course, far more impactful implementations of dynamic difficulty. Take the Resident Evil series. Depending on how
I thought he was going to talk about the blue shell.
accurate your shooting is and how often you take damage or get killed, enemy behavior and even the amount of them will change, making things more manageable for those who struggle by having enemies be less aggressive, and giving a nice bit of extra challenge for those that have things down by making the baddies more hostile. On paper, adaptive difficulty is perfect, as it takes the decision out of the player's hand by making adjustments based on their actual performance over a long portion of time. Most Resident Evil titles do still have difficulty options, but players don't need to be as exact with their guesses of what's right for them, because the game will adjust to a more comfortable spot.
Yeah, and that's something that really kind of turned me off from a lot of the Resident Evils, because I've seen people play it, and it just really seemed off-putting to me how variably the enemies could absorb damage due to like being shot in the head or things like that. It just seemed like the enemies were simultaneously spongy yet paper thin, and also I don't know, it felt a little bit all over the place, and I could never really get a handle of it. So yeah,
approach like this helps preserve.
Yeah, some of the Resident Evils definitely have adaptive difficulty where your bullets essentially will start kind of doing less damage, essentially. And it makes things spongier because you're not wasting shots, and so the game kind of ramps up the difficulty to compensate for that. And I don't like that.
Game feel and flow, keeping the pace of a game as smooth and as enjoyable as possible. And when looking at a title like Resident Evil 4, which is maybe the best paced game ever made, it's a hard idea to argue with. Also, as it is done subtly and isn't something Capcom seemingly ever talks about, most players won't even notice it. So clearing sections even after they've been made easier feels just as satisfying, because the player will assume they finally got good enough to overcome it. The thing is, and maybe this makes me a stubborn old man, most of the time I don't want to feel as if I've gotten good enough to overcome something. I want to get good enough to overcome something. And it's not even about the principle of the matter, it's just that I like figuring things out, and if I know the game is figuring some of it out for me, I feel a bit cheated. I care about this sort of thing more with some titles than others, but in general, I'd rather avoid it. Now, I personally don't mind when a game gets harder if I'm playing well, as like I said, I enjoy getting past things by the skin of my teeth, but a part of me doesn't love the idea of getting bumped up to a harder difficulty and then having that new challenge be taken away if I'm not immediately successful at it. It's also worth noting that the increased challenge could push players to approach encounters in a more cautious way that they find less enjoyable. This may make them more successful, but that's not necessarily the same thing as having more fun. All things.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to bring up as well, and something that I think he said it somewhat like that earlier. I just kind of thought it and just didn't say it, but yeah. Canchel, welcome back to the stream. It's been a minute. It was a complaint in the RE2 remake that headshots acted like body shots. Many games now just make damage sponges. It's especially bad in ARPGs now. It doesn't make fights hard, it just makes it a slog. Yeah, we've been talking about that a bit, that tedium isn't necessarily difficulty. Well, the difficulty of dealing with the tedium is having the patience to slog through it, by all means.
Considered. For a lot of people, especially those who don't really care about these things, adaptive difficulty is one of the better approaches. But for me personally, with most games, I'd always rather play with it off, as I want all the credit to go to me. But I don't think the majority of titles that incorporate some form of it would really want to have a visible toggle, as drawing attention to it takes away a lot of the magic. For all these reasons, as irrational as it may sound, a part of me prefers when a game has no difficulty options. I like not having to worry whether or not I'm playing with the right settings, or if the game is making things easier for me without me knowing. The experience is what it is, and there's something to that simplicity that's kind of nice. I think in some cases, it also pushes people to embrace a game's difficulty in a way they might not have had there been options. And yeah, I'm sure you knew I'd get here sooner or later, but this is the part of the video where I start talking about Dark Souls. The Souls series, and really every modern FromSoft title, has become the centerpiece of difficulty discourse, and that's because the relentless nature of these games is one of the major reasons many have become so attached to them. There is something something about their cruel and bleak worlds that is strangely compelling, and the gameplay feeds into that feeling so well. They present so many challenges that take a ton of effort to overcome, so getting to the point where you are able to overcome them feels incredible. With most titles, the gap between having and not having a great grasp of the core gameplay is going to be noticeable, but more often than not, people in either camp will still be able to progress. But with Dark Souls, that is not the case. That gap makes all the difference in the world, and while there are multiple approaches of how to close it, at one point or another, the player has to figure out how to do it. And when they do, that feeling is unforgettable. Before playing Demon's Souls for the first time, I didn't think hard games were my thing, but it proved to me that they could be. And playing Dark Souls made it clear that I didn't just like them, but that they had the potential to be the most meaningful gaming experiences I've ever had. With Demon's Souls in particular, had it been designed with multiple difficulty options, I don't know for sure whether or not I would have switched to a lower one, but I definitely would have been constantly questioning if I had picked the right choice. Instead though, all I could really do was focus on finding a way through the game. I had to
Yeah, I don't know what I would have done with Dark Souls, because it just felt like I wasn't getting it for a long time. And that's a little bit different than not knowing if a game is too difficult or too easy, you know? So anyway, cool, computer doing that again. Hey, howdy, welcome back to the stream. Captini says, Metal Gear Solid 5 had a perfect solution of giving the chicken hat for if you reduce difficulty mid-mission. Yeah. There's something about a definitive presentation rather than a sliding scale where you're not sure what the definitive experience should be. Yeah, and so it really is a difficult thing to do to balance a game properly in a way that is challenging, not a pushover, is difficult at parts, but not oppressive. So it's definitely beyond me to create a system. Well, it's one thing to look at a system and like point to what doesn't work as well as it could. It's another thing entirely to develop a system from scratch and then balance it that way. So it kind of always boggles my mind how people can do that, whether it be something like a board game or something more complex, like having multiple systems integrated into something like a video game. One of the biggest roadblocks for Hey You in Dark Souls 1 is not knowing that rolls gave you iframes. Oh, really? I mean, I didn't really know of iframes as a term, but yeah, I think it's just something that I intuitively picked up.
Embrace its uncomfortable challenge or else be out $60. And that experience of going from thinking it'd be impossible to scraping and clawing my way to the credits meant a lot to me. And I know this is not a unique occurrence. Almost everyone I've talked to about these titles who's fallen in love with them has gone through something similar, and a lot of the time what they got out of it transcended the game itself. From helping people cope with depression and anxiety to teaching them that even when something seems impossible, it can still be overcome, these games have grown to mean so much more to people than just a way to spend their spare time. While it isn't the only factor, the unyielding nature of these titles is a big reason why people love them so much. And having a single set difficulty is part of what makes that possible. Of course, the consequence of being designed in this way is that it creates a skill window the player must fit within in order to stand a reasonable chance of enjoying them.
That felt a little bit too familiar, being in the Elite Knight armor set with his Zweihander in front of the stupid Moonlight Butterfly.
The gameplay. As nice as it is to not spend time thinking about whether you chose the right setting or not, the trade-off is there's a chance you'll be questioning whether you are the right player for the game or not. When a title has a set difficulty that's on the more punishing side of things, by design it will be less approachable than a game that has options, and some players just won't have the skill it takes to get through it. And that idea is daunting and can make it hard to want to engage with them in the first place. With that said, when it comes to a lot of titles that fall into this camp, like Dark Souls and pretty much everything else FromSoft has put out in the past 15 years, the skill needed in order to play and enjoy them isn't nearly as high as their reputation makes it out to be. Many people do choose to play them in a way that requires high skill and proficiency, but aside from arguably Sekiro, FromSoft has always designed their games in a way that gives many different options to players so they aren't stuck with an approach that's not well suited for their skill set. It's just that these are chosen.
All right, so I've been thinking that in some ways, talking about a game like Path of Exile and its difficulty, I think is kind of misguided in terms of like actual difficulty, because the times where I've died in Path of Exile, like in higher tier content, is mostly when I'm being one shot due to mechanics that I don't have like the proper mitigation for, or if something goes a bit beyond my control due to like random modifiers on like certain enemies or like league mechanics and things like that. Um, but as far as like the mechanical skill goes, it's not like the game gets more difficult. It's more like the difficulty in Path of Exile comes from the knowledge or lack thereof of the game rather than the game itself. So like Path of Exile 2 looks like it's trying to reset that a bit, but I mean that's probably only because the game is still new and we don't know everything about it yet, and like how the bosses move and stuff like that. But I don't know. So I'm just gonna need to dwell on that one a little bit more. Scalweezy says, ideally in a difficult game, failing a challenge would only feed your motivation to overcome it, but that's a fine line to ride between a satisfying challenge and a discouraging one. Yeah, like I was saying the other day on stream, when I first beat Quelaag, she was the first boss that I killed on my first try, and I was like, hell yeah, but no, I'm kind of disappointed. That was a lot easier than I expected, you know? So it was like a really bittersweet moment because I'd finally gotten good, but it was dissatisfying, and that's definitely not what I expected. So like I got what I wanted, but like the finger of the monkey paw curled in the process. Captini's children were 9 and 11 when they played DS3 and got up to the Big Hat Wizard guy before getting bored and starting to play the other games. Like the Crystal Sage? Yeah, I think that wouldn't surprise me too much because I think the game really comes into its own right after the Crystal Sage, essentially. Which is kind of funny for me to say that. Wait, is that... The Swamp is after that, essentially, or... I don't know. I just like the part of the game a lot more after the Crystal Sages. Two Hit says, they think the Souls games generally provide many ways to mitigate difficulty and how you engage with it. It's hard to choose. It's hard if you choose to make it hard, but it can be easy too. That is very true, especially if you go online and summon and things like that, or if you try to level a bit. But there are limits to that because a lot of the games are punishing where players aren't going to be able to level up because they aren't able to amass the souls needed to do that, to overlevel the content that they're like coming into grips with. Dark Souls 1 especially was much worse about it because there was no ability to respec your character. And in Dark Souls 3, it kind of takes a little bit of time to get to that point where you're able to respec. And so the very first challenge of the Dark Souls games beyond, Taurus Demon is essentially that meta knowledge of how the stats work and what weapons you're going to be able to use to work with what stats. Because once you understand how that stuff works, the games are a hell of a lot easier. Like, I have not had near as many problems in Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring than I did in Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 is, a bit of its own issue, but I'll leave that one in the bin. The rock, paper, scissors of the Souls games also play into it. Yeah, and then Elden Ring is especially goes into that next level of incorporating the spirit ashes, which I think is probably the most brilliant thing that they could have done to make the game a lot more accessible to players in a way that was removed from fully summoning other players, with the exception of kind of the Mimic tier, but anyway. Hey, you says, is there a length limit of videos you're willing to cover? And if there is, would you consider covering certain sections? So, typically, because I stream for about 3 hours, I tend to react to a video for about an equivalent length. So I would try to shoot for like 1 and a half hours is like the upper limit of a video that I'm willing to cover. But I will also consider watching something over multiple streams, depending on how good it is. Ava asks, what about the Elden Beast? You heard a lot of horror stories where players, had to respec from a magic build to a physical build because of that boss. You can beat him with a physical build. It's just kind of garbage. And so the difficulty of that boss is a bit different, and it could have been completely mitigated, I feel, if it was a boss fight where you could ride Torrent, for example. But yeah, I do think it is that fight in itself had other issues beyond that, but definitely not their best work, I would say. Okay.
Chosen through the gameplay instead of an options menu. Looking at Dark Souls specifically, you don't need to just tackle it with a sword. There are solid ranged options as well as a ton of powerful spells, both of which allow players to keep distance from enemies while still being able to do damage. Most likely, neither will fully replace the need to engage in melee combat, but using them will make it less frequent, letting the player stay out of harm's way more often. Using these mechanics doesn't make the game unchallenging, but as they don't require the same level of precision that fighting an enemy with just a sword does, they do make it possible for players that don't have a quick reaction skill set to find success. The most useful mechanic to help players overcome tough challenges though is the summoning system, which allows them to fight alongside NPCs or even other players. Having a summon does increase the health of bosses, but the vast majority of the time, that shift doesn't come close to outweighing the benefit that comes from having a partner. Playing with a summon fundamentally changes the dynamics of every encounter. It becomes less about fully learning a boss's moveset and more about capitalizing on the moments that their focus is on the other person. This doesn't lead to fights being mindless, but it does make it easier to find an opening to attack. NPC summons are available for many of the bosses, and player summons can be placed at pretty much any of them, so with enough luck, there will be an option to bring in some help. In general, I find this approach to be pretty cool, as it pushes players to discover what mechanics are best suited for them. Getting stuck is an opportunity for the player to assess all of the options at their disposal and utilize whatever ones will help them move forward. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work, but in reality, it isn't nearly that clean. Dark Souls doesn't do a whole lot to explain anything really, so for a first-time player it can be unclear how to engage with systems like magic and especially summoning. Neither is super complicated, and the game does do a handful of things to try to get players to stumble across how both work, but this approach makes them easy to overlook or even miss, causing new players.
So it is really awkward if you don't begin as a sorcerer or a pyromancer to understand how the magic system works in terms of attuning a spell, and I do think it feels like garbage having to invest in the attunement stat, because the benefits of doing so aren't nearly as readily apparent as leveling up like health, strength, vitality, that kind of thing, because you see the bar like rise up, whereas if you level attunement, you might not even get a new spell slot. So yeah, I don't know. Obviously, while magic can make the game a lot easier, it does require a lot more knowledge of like enemy placement, and for most players, they probably can't rely fully on magic because they don't have enough magic to go through each area. So yeah, I don't know. In some ways, like the game does push a lot of newer players to the melee oriented playstyle, which is, kind of a good thing, but it's also good that it opens up avenues for players more familiar with the games to enjoy them in different ways too.
To be far more likely to default to simpler options like melee. For many, the way they'll learn how these things work is by looking them up, which I don't think is entirely a bad thing, as the sharing of knowledge helps build community, and that has no doubt played a big role in Dark Souls growing such a strong one, but also it can be frustrating when mechanics that would benefit a player immensely either take a bit of luck or an external source to figure out. Also,
yeah, and so my policy about whether or not I think it's a good thing in a game is when, hold on, let me rephrase that. So I categorically think having to look to external sources of information about the game to learn more about the game is kind of a bad thing to a degree. And what I mean by that is I think it's bad when you have to close the game or literally leave the screen to figure out more about it, rather than having something diegetic in the game to give you a better clue as to what to do. So, what's a game that has like a really good tutorialization of like spells and stuff or interactions? Okay, so like the Star Ocean games literally have encyclopedias within them that explains anything you ever want to know. The Dragon Quest games have something similar. Well, depending on which game you're playing, where you're able to look at tutorials and figure things out really easily. Many of the Final Fantasy games have things like that where it gets explained, which is perfectly fine. And so for those types of games, if you want to go online and like figure out the most broken strategies, that's perfectly fine to me. Like that makes sense. You know, you're just trying to min max. Whereas I think it's bad when you need to try to understand the basics of a game through external sources, like trying to figure out where to get the next sorcery spell. That can be a good or a bad thing because, you know, if it's like a hidden secret, I have like mixed feelings about that because it sucks to miss something on your first playthrough. So if anybody's just trying to like get a functional build, I totally understand that. In Lords of the Fallen, I got through like halfway through the game and I didn't have another Inferno Catalyst. And I was like, okay, I feel like I'm missing something. Where did I go wrong? Well, it turns out that I got down to the bottom of Skyrest Bridge and I got the key and I thought I went through the door to go meet the tortured prisoner and get that other catalyst, but I didn't. I forgot, but I thought I had. So I definitely screwed up. And so that is, you know, my fault. And so looking up something like that, I think is fine because I done goofed, you know. But it also would have been nice if there were more game hints to be like, oh, go this way. Or maybe not something like quite that direct, but like, hey, somebody knows more about like the pyromancies in this area. Or something along those lines to like help guide players a bit more, even though I definitely screwed up. Nectarine, welcome back to the stream. Faith barely has any damaging miracles at the start. Yeah, true story. The Faith in a lot of the games definitely suffers that way because if you don't have any access to the lightning, you're pretty boned. Like they're pretty just like supportive stuff essentially. Hey Stella, welcome back. You just got here, but your 2 cents is that accessibility is good, but ultimately it's still going to end up falling into what the mechanics and game type are. Elden Ring won't be like Resident Evil 4, won't be like AW2. I'm not sure what AW2 is. Armored Warfare 2? I don't know. Slay the Spire is a tour de force in terms of text clarity? Okay. Scalazy says, if they're not careful from relying on players to explain everything, could end up like Bethesda relying on modders for their games. I mean, it's already that way. Oh, Alan Wake 2. I don't know. I didn't think about that. I mean, that's kind of how it already is, Scalazy. Captini loved Morrowind's journal system. It helped to remember what you were doing at certain points without turning quests into park ride that you're just on. Yeah, and that's kind of one of the ones that we've been bringing up a lot more recently. Because like the Bethesda games are like the poster children of the what I would say like the maybe like the theme park isification of games, theme parkification of like games, where you're just kind of like set onto this loot treadmill, and it's kind of like self-propelling you through the game rather than being something you interact with and learn more about. And that's kind of why Dark Souls was what I've been saying is like the factory reset of gaming for quite a lot of people. Hey Teen Sith, how's it going? How was everybody's Ava adventure? I forgot Mortis is in the chat. I should have asked him. But yeah.
As far as summoning goes, it relies on having humanity, which is a relatively scarce resource, so if a player runs out, they no longer can get assistance until they find more. Mix this with being susceptible to getting invaded when in human form, and it creates a bunch of hoops struggling players need to jump through to get the help they need. And some of those hoops just aren't very fun. Like in order to
I'm gonna back this up because I got distracted. But all right, hey, you said Ronnie's questline is by far the worst example for this too. LOL. You do not at all believe the majority of players who got Ronnie's ending got it organically. I mean, it's extremely easy to get Ronnie's ending. It is kind of like shoehorned in because if you kill Radon, you'll meet Blythe, and Blythe will tell you what to do. So if you just follow what he says, relatively speaking, after that point, if you go to the Karian Manor, it's pretty straightforward. So I don't know. I could see like a lot of people getting the Ronnie ending. People doing Millicent's quest line, I think, is a hell of a lot more sketch because she's really easily missable. Same thing. Well, Alexander has a lot of fail safes, but Nefeli Lu is definitely really bad, and Hayata is really easily missed as well. On Steam, Ronnie's ending achievement has more players than the default ending. Very sus. So I do think some of those numbers are probably overinflated in terms of people who like looked up how to do Ronnie's ending or like looked up the best ending. But I also don't blame them because in previous FromSoft titles, certain endings were hidden and had more bosses to encounter. So I think there's like a little bit of both, where the ending wasn't like particularly difficult to complete, but there's also going to be an overlap of those who looked it up as well. All right. Thanks, Teen Sith. Is your first ending, but you were really focused on completing it, and you knew that in Dark Souls games you can miss things? Yeah, okay. If you don't speak to everyone. No, you couldn't finish Nefeli's quest at the start. Okay, going back to the vid.
If a player runs out, they no longer can get assistance until they find more. Mix this with being susceptible to getting invaded when in human form, and it creates a bunch of hoops struggling players need to jump through to get the help they need. And some of those hoops just aren't very fun. Like, in order to be able to use summons consistently, struggling players will probably need to farm humanity, which sucks because killing these stupid rats over and over again is not compelling gameplay, but a decent amount of people will feel incentivized to do it anyway. And this is a major problem that comes from using difficulty as a way to incentivize engaging with a title's various mechanics. It can instead lead to unfortunate player behavior. When I think back to my first experience with Demon's Souls, as much as I find myself romanticizing it now, I didn't really find the moment-to-moment gameplay to be all that fun. I never got good at fighting, and I died so many times that I barely even had the option to use summons. So to get through the game, I did stuff like this, and this, and this. I would grind the same group of enemies for far too long so that I could get souls to level up and buy as many arrows as I could afford in order to cheese bosses. This isn't an invalid way to play Demon's Souls,
so
Dark
great.
Souls, or any of the others, but as someone who has now beaten pretty much everything FromSoft has recently put out, I do think it is the least enjoyable approach. However, for some players it will feel like the only approach, and depending on their skill, it might be. While I do like the Dark Souls design philosophy of presenting all players with the same challenge and giving them a wealth of gameplay options so they can find what works best for them, it does have the potential to create a disconnect between how a player wants to play and how they need to play. Like, it's great that summons are an option, but as I said before, they do fundamentally—
I've kind of got PTSD of killing the Capra Demon, so I'm like, hold on, we'll see it.
all players with the same challenge and create a disconnect between how a player
Yeah, seeing that running back there in the background's got me on edge after that dude died because I got stabbed in the back.
wants to play and how they need to play. Like, it's great that summons are an option, but as I said before, they do fundamentally change how boss fights work, and it leads to a much different experience than fighting them solo. There's nothing wrong with either approach, however, if a player prefers what combat feels like without having a summon, but gets completely stuck on every boss they try to take on alone, they'll kind of be forced into using one if they want to progress. And as using summons is so different, doing this won't really help them get better at fighting bosses alone, so it doesn't even act as a way to build up to a new challenge. On the other end of things, more skilled players who enjoy summons, whether it be for lore or gameplay reasons, may feel like they can't really use them without things getting too easy. Obviously, they can't—
Yeah, and that's how I really felt about a lot of Dark Souls 2, where I would just kill the boss on my own first, and because I was save scumming the game, I would go back and reload it and then do like the things that I needed to do for lore wise. And I didn't I think I actually did something similar like that in Elden Ring because I noticed some summon signs and I didn't know if they. Yeah, I'm pretty confident I did that as well in Elden Ring. That if there were summon signs outside a boss room, like the fire giant, I'd kill the fire giant on my own. I'd reload my game and then I summoned Alexander for him because I didn't know if that was like a quest requirement or not. But yeah, that's definitely what I did for Elden Ring, which is why I think these games should have more save slots because that way you can like customize these experiences. So I got the satisfaction of killing the boss on my own, but I would not have had that satisfaction if I felt the pressure of missing out on an NPC quest. So it just that's probably like my biggest complaint about all the from the modern FromSoft games. I didn't completely miss Placidus Axe, or maybe yeah, I don't remember if I'd beaten the game, but I definitely missed it my first time through Farum Azula. That's for sure. You've beaten the game 5 times and never been to the Jarbaron village. Got to look up where it is. It's right next to the Karian Study Academy, study hall, by the Tibia Mariner. You just gotta like drop down the cliff a bunch. Yeah, people who've beaten the Souls games with the DDR pad. Yeah, Luality, she's a beast. More hardcore gamer than I am. Placidus Axe is very well hidden. Yeah. Tell me about it. Welcome into the stream, Fearless Noob. Yeah, you think that something that would help with getting better is the means to refight bosses? Yeah, for sure. I would have loved so much on my first time going through Dark Souls to have had saves. Then once I beat the game to go back to the saves in front of the bosses with my crappy character and then just, styled on them with my like better handle of the gameplay mechanics. Two Hit says that there's bosses where you feel like you got lucky more than you actually fully learned the fight. Oh yeah, no, I would definitely say that's a thing, and I think a lot of players get a misunderstanding of their actual representation of skill because they may have gotten a lucky break on a boss, or the first time they played through the game they were over leveled for the boss but they didn't realize it. Like I've been in streams for like Bloodborne, and I've seen people go through the DLC and beaten all the bosses, and then they go back to the base game to see what all they missed, and then they go down and fight Abritus. And if they kill her like the first or second try, they're like, "Oh yeah, that boss wasn't that easy." And so I've said something in chat to them about that before. I'm like, "Oh yeah, this boss isn't really that easy. You just went through the DLC first, so you're a little over leveled for this content." And then the person got mad at me for saying that, but I wasn't trying to be a jerk about it. I was just like trying to like let them know that I wasn't taking anything away from them, but their experience wasn't kind of like at the intended difficulty curve. So calling the boss easy to me was just like I don't think you really understand that like the boss that you fought isn't the boss that was you were designed to face at that point in the game. So I kind of do wish to an extent that there was a little bit of an adjusting of difficulty, especially with like the way that the DLCs get integrated into the games. Like fighting the Soul of Cinder after fighting Gale is an absolute joke of a pushover. Like you'll probably beat him 1 to 3 tries very easily. And so for players who never played through the base game fully, but they do the DLC before fighting Soul of Cinder, I just feel really bad for them because they really miss out on the kind of curated experience of the full base game. So yeah. So Teen Sit said on a prior stream, but to her, a major flaw in the Souls games is lack of meaningful tutorial, making it really frustrating to learn for people not already familiar with the mechanics, to be honest. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and Mortis says DS2 conditioned you to always summon NPCs because you didn't want to miss out on quests. For sure. Fair stuff there. The last time you fought the Godskin duo, you summoned Bernal and your Mimic and brute forced it because you have no patience for it. That's very understandable, especially for those repeat bosses. That's right. I mock the new players and invalidate their success. No, I was just trying to like be helpful, but came off as prickish instead. The classic LP maneuver, I guess. You struggled with the brightness and eventually just settled on face tanking the charges. That's probably the smartest thing you could do, and something that I never did. Because I'm under the impression that like face tanking is worse than dodging, but it's definitely not for that move because the extra damage you take. Yeah.
Can just do a second playthrough with summons that's less focused on the challenge, but I don't think it's ideal that they'll feel the need to ignore the mechanic on their first in order to maintain a certain level of difficulty. In FromSoft's pursuit of having everyone face the same challenge, players are pushed towards or away from certain mechanics largely because of their skill and not their preferred playstyle. Depending on what group they fall into, they'll have completely different experiences that don't really resemble each other in any notable way. I don't think this is inherently a bad thing. For many players, this approach will get them to engage with the game in the way that's best suited for them. But for others, it will make them feel like they're only left with bad options. Some players just won't have the skill to beat bosses alone without putting in far more time than the vast majority of people. So it makes a lot of sense to me why someone in that position would want there to be multiple difficulties. If they could drop down to a lower setting that, among other things, had them deal more damage and take less of it, they'd be able to overcome bosses in a time frame that more closely resembles what it takes for the average player while still experiencing the core gameplay of solo combat. And technically, this is something people can do in Dark Souls. It just requires grinding, a solution that comes at the cost of the core gameplay loop turning into a tedious waste of time. I know some people will say that these kinds of games just aren't for these kinds of players, but I don't think it's that simple. Not being good at something doesn't mean you can't love it. Feeling skilled out of a game you adore has to be frustrating, especially because there is so much more to these titles than them just being hard. And honestly, this is something FromSoft seems to be very conscious of based on how the design of their games has shifted over the years. This is best seen with Elden Ring, which pretty effectively addresses some of the pain points that are common for less experienced players. And in typical FromSoft fashion, they even managed to do it without including traditional difficulty settings. Progress on the main quest is gated by a series of extremely difficult bosses, the first and arguably harshest being Margit. Trying to take any of them on without being properly prepared will most likely lead to failure, so players are incentivized to explore the lands between to collect runes, weapons, and all sorts of other resources in order to get strong enough to take on the immense challenge of the mandatory bosses. The difficulty pushes them to engage with the open world, which is great as it's Elden Ring's most interesting aspect. There are so many things to do, and many of them are manageable challenges even for less skilled players. While some endeavors will be more rewarding for certain builds than others, players will almost always walk away with their character being stronger than they were before. The answer to getting stuck is to check out somewhere else, and this is a much more satisfying solution than grinding the same group of enemies over and over again. For those who struggle with these games but don't enjoy using
Yeah, and one thing that I've been thinking about in relation to difficulty lately is that this kind of ties into the video that I made about Call of Duty and engagement metrics, is that having more options to get to the end goal is a lot better for players and also gives a bit more of an organic feedback loop for what players actually want to interact with. So for example, with like the whole like Destiny stuff, I think a lot of the systemic stuff that the devs have put into the game is just absolute trash that's designed to increase player metrics or engagement metrics rather than things that players want to engage with. So like for every week they have bounties that the players can do, and a lot of players do the bounties just for their associated rewards rather than making each activity rewarding in a way that's rewarding enough for the player. I mean, like, reward's just a real big problem with that game in general, but I think because they have these basic rewards tied to certain things and they only allow one route to get those rewards, which is similar to like World of Warcraft and pretty much every other MMO, that it ends up being a smokescreen that works against the devs because they can't actually get an accurate understanding of what the players find enjoyable versus what the players feel they need to actually grind out. And so it's just a bass-ackwards design in which I think they could alleviate a lot of these stress points by having multiple ways to get rewards. And so that way players can choose the way that they want to do it. And so Elden Ring in certain ways does solve a lot of those problems by having a world large enough to facilitate players moving away from bosses if they're not ready. But no matter what option you provide, there's definitely going to be players who smash their heads against the wall and try to beat the whatever challenge you put in front of them, even if it's supposed to be a challenge they shouldn't beat, you know? It's just the nature of some people to do so. So, moral of the story is there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Get wrecked, scrub. I don't know. You didn't find Margit uniquely difficult, not gonna lie. You've been told parrying BSB is easy, but you can't parry to save your life. So, uniquely difficult, that is a very interesting way to say that. I think the issue with Margit is, as a kind of quote-unquote tutorial boss, he is comparable with Genichiro in terms of difficulty if you don't go out of your way and like level up in other places. So if you just try to fight him first, because he's kind of like the first boss, because it is possible to like make a beeline towards a Halle Church and then kind of miss the Tree Sentinel. But yeah, those first two bosses are way more difficult than players might expect. I think Elden Ring might be better if the Tree Sentinel got moved somewhere else, somewhere further away, maybe by like the minor Erd Tree in Limgrave, because it can give people the impression that all of the like enemies or the bosses are going to be as difficult as the Tree Sentinel, especially. Logarius has made you rage quit. Okay, so that's what you meant by uniquely difficult? So yeah, I mean, there are certainly a number of bosses in each game which are difficult, but I do think Margit is unduly difficult for that section of the game, especially when you compare him to a boss like Renala, which is just kind of like a wet noodle in comparison. It acts as, of course, it acts as a smokescreen because everyone will naturally gravitate towards instant gratification rather than delayed. That's part of human nature to go to the path of least resistance. Yeah, well, I mean, in Destiny 2, at least, you don't really have other paths, so it definitely becomes a smokescreen. They don't have enough branching paths to fulfilling rewards. All right. Going back to the video.
And summons, this gives them a way to still play on their own without spending time doing repetitive activities. As for summons, Elden Ring adjusted how they work to make them far more reliable. NPC summons don't require the use of an item, so using them is always an option. Player summons are still tied to one, but it's so easy to get that it's rarely a barrier. And of course, Spirit Ashes can be used pretty much on every boss, and they offer a wide range of companions to choose from that can help with various challenges. They also can be upgraded, making them a very powerful part of the player's arsenal. All of this not only expands the skill window significantly, but it also gives players more viable and interesting ways to handle the challenge. Now,
so Scowleezy says, I think part of why Margit is so hard is to really drive home that you can and should just go explore as much as you can. So I think I would be more willing to accept that if they didn't have the player immediately die to the grafted scion either. Because between the grafted scion, potentially the Tree Sentinel, and then Margit, there's 3 examples of enemies which seem almost indomitable to defeat for a normal player in quick succession next to each other. So it can just give the unintended illusion that this is how all the bosses are going to be. This is where Elden Ring begins, you know? That's kind of the impression that it can give, even if that isn't necessarily what it's supposed to, because the first 2 bosses of the Grafted Scion and the Tree Sentinel, at least with the Grafted Scion, there is no like plan B, there is no route B, you have to get your ass kicked. So I would be more willing to agree with you if there weren't so many players who didn't run into that issue of crashing their heads against Margit and the Tree Sentinel, even though the world is open. I think you're right to an extent, but the game could have made that a bit clearer by delaying those experiences initially, I think. If anything, you nerf Margit's HP pool a bit. Maybe it's kind of, I don't think it's really that. I think some of it is just the variations of its attacks. So between the like super delays of some of his attacks to catch like roll dodges, and also the ability for him to catch heals with his dagger, I think if you removed him throwing the dagger at a range for his very first encounter, that probably would have made him a lot easier for most players. Because also at that point in the game, you have a very limited amount of flasks to begin with. And so if it gets interrupted, that's pretty much rip right there. Is he going to mention how 2 Spirit Ashes makes all the other spirits completely obsolete? I don't know. We'll see. Or not.
As much as I wish I could say that this is the perfect approach, unfortunately it does create some issues. Uncovering the secrets of the lands between was my favorite part of the game, so I wanted to do a ton of it. But as exploring had a direct correlation to my character's strength, that resulted in me getting over-leveled quickly. Enemies and bosses don't scale as you level up, which can make a lot of them become trivial. For the middle chunk of the game, I found everything
Yeah, and that was also my experience, because as I said on stream like yesterday and many other times, when I first played through Elden Ring, I avoided Stormveil because I was more or less, doing my whole Skyrim style, avoid the main story stuff because, ooh, piece of candy, ADHD, just following each little breadcrumb on the trail, taking me across multiple continents before I was like, no, I need to stop before I get too overleveled. So I did eventually go back to Stormveil, and then I killed Margit my first time, and I felt bad about that. So then I just stopped using my Spirit Ashes, and I killed Godric really quickly too. I did kill Godric my first time as well, and I was disappointed because I'd known I'd leveled up too much by that point. So I was actually really happy when I got to Altus Plateau and fought Godfrey, because I was like, oh my god, you could refight the bosses, and they're going to be more difficult. This is great. And then, nope, joke's on me. That was just kind of a fluke, one-time thing. So, anyway.
I came across to be pretty easy. I was able to muscle through boss fights on my first try without having to learn how they work or even really be cautious. This put me in a spot where I felt like I had to choose between exploring and having things feel challenging, which was a bummer, as those are my 2 favorite things about the game. One of my friends ran into a similar issue and actually decided to stop upgrading his main weapon so that things wouldn't get too easy. I thought about doing the same, but I ended up not, as I like the feeling of my character progressing. Seeing number go up is part of what motivates me, and choosing to opt out of certain upgrades would cause exploring to be a little pointless. While I wish I could explore stuff for the sake of exploring, I am very extrinsically motivated, so it just didn't seem like a good option. Also, trying to balance the difficulty by only upgrading things to a certain point starts to feel a lot like games with tons of difficulty options that can be adjusted, and just like with that,
I think that's a good point as well. And obviously I bring up this point quite a bit when I talk about the quote-unquote intended difficulty of Elden Ring, that I think it could have been somewhat solved or hinted at if merchants in each area were able to provide a base weapon level comparable to the area that they were in, so that way people would have an idea of what to expect for where they were. So that way if you go into Liurnia, you realize you might need like a +5 to +8 weapon or something like that a merchant can sell. Or if they sold a couple of the upgrades to get to that point, it would probably have helped ease out some of those awkward transitions. Classic LP. Yeah, I killed Godric. Didn't use any Spirit Ashes. I was just too powerful. No, I was definitely overleveled for that point. 2-hit accidentally skipped Stormveil the first time. Feels bad, man. I mentioned NGUs. I don't even know what an NGU is. What is that? Captini always acted. DS1 tried to limit your Oh, after DS1, you tried to limit your level to 40 in your first playthrough for fun and to be able to gank people better. Barb was recently doing rune level 1, but also not upgrading any weapons. He was last getting stomped in by Godskin Duo. Ooh, that sounds really rough. Yeah, I kind of have always felt that like soul level 1 runs and stuff were just kind of like fake challenge runs. I mean, this is where my elitism is going to shine, but I feel like uh-oh. Uh, I feel like for the true challenge run, you'd probably want an unupgraded weapon rather than just being like level 1. I mean, not rather, but also being level 1, just because that's going to make things the most challenging. But I think it's also kind of ridiculous because it's just tedious. So I don't really, I don't know. I just kind of don't like the challenge run options for this game because for me at least, I would be more interested in doing a level 1 run of a game if I could use the weapon that I wanted to, but a lot of these weapons are kind of arbitrarily gated away by stat requirements, so it just kind of kills a lot of the enthusiasm that I would have for it otherwise. Morta says, you think SL1 challenges are a good gateway challenge for people wanting to start doing those? Yeah, they definitely are, for sure. Depends on the game. You think in DS3 the Sorcerer is harder than SL1? The Sorcerer is harder than SL1? Could you elaborate on that to it? Pork Whisperer, welcome in. I like your name. Level 1 runs are an entry level challenge generally. True story. Yeah, some people have done Elden Ring with fist and kick only. Sorcerer actually has fewer options and less health at a base level than SL1. Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I agree, Morlord, that Elden Ring could use a boss rush, especially with like the Everjail system. It would just be so good. Okay, I didn't know that sorcery only is harder than SL1. Interesting. Well, it is like it's not as challenging as it could be. So to me it's kind of like a baby challenge run cuz most of your damage really is going to come from a weapon. And to be fair, like when I was really introduced to like the whole concept of like the base level run, it was in Bloodborne where people were just abusing the hell out of beast papers and it just felt cheesy to me rather than like challenging. All right, thanks for the insight, guys.
That, how am I supposed to know what the right balance will be? I know some people will say do whatever is the most fun, but I have no idea how to figure that out without spending a bunch of time testing stuff, and that's not what I wanted to do. Elden Ring is a much smoother experience than FromSoft's previous titles, but it still runs into the same issue that pretty much every game with a single set difficulty does, of players needing to moderate what systems they engage with if they want to have things be a proper challenge. And that's especially a bummer when one of those systems is the best part of the game. So
And I think one way they could have solved that somewhat in Elden Ring is by having scaling tied to defeating certain bosses. And this is a topic that I discuss quite a bit when we talk about Elden Ring and open world games, where I often compare like my ideal version of an open world game to be something like a Mega Man style setting in an open world where if you kill one boss, the other bosses will start affecting other parts of the map and stuff. And so, um, let's say you kill a more challenging boss like Radon first rather than Godric and Renala. Well, then maybe like their enemies or their soldiers and whatnot could get buffed to a certain degree. And you could keep going with that idea up until the end of the game. And I think that would also give a lot of replayability where if you kill the bosses in different orders, that could affect like the different types of moves that they have. But obviously, that would take a hell of a lot of work to have so many iterations of every enemy in all of their placements and things like that. So beyond that, I think Elden Ring, like one of its greatest weaknesses is just how static the world is, which might be kind of on brand for the story that they're trying to make. But that's just like one of the issues of like story and lore versus gameplay mechanics, where I feel like gameplay mechanics should outweigh lore to some degree. Anyway. BL4 no buffs is a legit hard challenge because visceral damage is destroyed. Yeah, and so to me that would be like a very respectable like challenge run of a game. Yeah, I only do my challenge runs using a DDR dance pad or the Guitar Hero controller. I've got my Guitar Hero controller somewhere in my closet. I could pull that out. Definitely won't play a game that way. No, I don't like challenge runs anyway, just because I'm not like that precise. Like I'm not that consistent at that level of high precision for long enough to keep my focus to do them and like be happy with it. So like back when I played Guitar Hero, I did beat Through the Fire and the Flames on expert multiple times, but for most songs on expert, like I would never try to 100% them just because I don't have the focus to allow me to do that. El Degusta said Mega Man X games were geniuses for doing that, freezing lava from killing Chill Penguin and the like. Absolutely, it's one of my like favorite game design, like level design things in all of video gaming, and I just want that, but 2023 version.
So, what? Would adding difficulty options be a way to fix these issues? And I mean, yeah, they would fix a lot of them, but then there would be new ones that would be solved by not having difficulty options.
I regret pausing so frequently, but just like I think rather than having sliders, I think tying it to in-game events would probably be the more elegant solution because over time players will kind of discover like the event triggers and then they can kind of customize their run more to their liking. And so, yeah, I think that would just work better than the generic slider.
The reality is, it's all kind of bad. There are problems with every approach, and it is unlikely that a game will ever feel perfectly balanced. Of course, in a lot of instances, it will be close enough. I do want to make it clear that the challenge of finding the perfect way to balance difficulty in video games is not an epidemic or anything that severe, but it is a problem that lacks an ideal solution. And frankly, there is so much more to it than what I've covered here. This whole video looks at balance from the perspective of players wanting a challenge that feels suited for their skill level, but in reality, that's not what everyone wants. Some people love the power fantasy of decimating everything they come in contact with, and others like feeling powerless in whether or not what they do will help them succeed. Or at least I assume they do, otherwise I don't know why anyone would still be playing League. And on that note, there's a ton to be said about how to balance the difficulty of multiplayer games, because for someone to win, a different person has to lose. This is made more complicated by the fact that an evenly balanced lobby is not necessarily a fun lobby, as it can lead to a playstyle that is overly sweaty and disincentivizes doing anything outside the meta, but the alternative means a certain chunk of players will just always lose, so who should be prioritized? Additionally, it's important to consider how accessibility fits in, as even though it's different from difficulty and the two should not be conflated, there is overlap between them. The goal...
So, yeah, talking about multiplayer and difficulty, I'm not entirely sure how, like, if that's the right term to use for that. I think the issue with multiplayer games is just, like, the issue of competition in general. Like, I think, for me personally, a game like League of Legends or Overwatch is a hell of a lot more fun when I don't play it competitively, because I do not get enjoyment out of having to sweat to win, because very quickly I realized in order to win, you need to more or less, well, hold on, you don't necessarily need to, but you're more likely to win by abusing the strategies which offer the greatest chance of success. So what does that mean? Using the meta, because the meta works for a reason, and of course, like, there are off meta things that can work against the meta and stuff like that, depending on like what you're doing, and there is a lot of nuance to go with it. But generally speaking, you want to increase your chances of victory, and so doing that might incentivize you into a kind of play style that you might not enjoy as much because you're over prioritizing the dub than the fun. At least that's how I've come to interact with many competitive games. So is that difficulty, or is that just the byproduct of competition, or is there another factor that goes into it, which I just don't know what to call right now? Could be one of those things. I'm not sure. In 1982, they made a perfectly balanced karate game for the Atari, and it ended up being super boring. Obligatory meta this, meta that. You never met a woman? Exactly. Got him. Hey, Kid Man, welcome back to the stream. Nice to see you again.
Of accessibility options is to address specific issues and barriers that exist for different disabled players, and in some cases that involves including settings that impact difficulty. So developers also have to consider how best to implement these features so that they are actually effective tools for those who need them. Ultimately, there are so many things to consider when balancing a game, and there will always be some downside to whatever choice is made.
Oh yeah, so here's a game where the accessibility of it kind of prevented me from enjoying it as much as I wanted to, and oddly enough, it was Cuphead. And I guess you could also say Super Smash Brothers to an extent, but anyway, with Cuphead, I didn't like the inputs needed to like jump or dodge, one of the two actions, and I know you could like automate it with like one of the trinkets or something like that, but it just felt a lot more clunky to me than I ever would have expected just like looking at the game. And so I really only played a small amount of Cuphead, even though it was a game that I was really, really looking forward to before playing, because I really loved the art style, like the whole rubber hose art and whatnot. So yeah, I don't know. So accessibility is different from difficulty, and I think that is an important thing to note, but there is a lot of overlap, as I've said before. And Pork Whisperer said, you think FromSoft intended you to be a bit OP for at least some of the areas in your first playthrough? I don't think they could have, I don't think they had enough time to really fully balance everything. So I think that just kind of became a byproduct. I don't know if I would say that they intended players to be OP at times. I think they intended certain areas to be more difficult, and for players to experience challenge at some point throughout their playthrough, and I'm sure they kind of met that goal, but I think the byproduct of that was not being able to balance everything so that the game was always properly challenging for the player, because it would have taken way too much time and effort, and there's the whole cost benefit ratio to consider as well. All right, Teen Sith, you have a good night. Thanks for dropping in, and take care, as always. Captini says, meta is a trap in Overwatch. You have friends who are solid silvers, and they all watch the competitions and meta talk, but they don't realize that they're at a skill level where that meta doesn't work for them. Yeah, no, and those are another conversation that we can talk about, because there's a difference between following the meta and understanding why it works, and a difference in following the meta and not understanding why it works. And it sounds like your friends just don't have the capacity to understand the fundamentals of the meta and implement it into their gameplay. And of course, it could also just be a mechanical thing. There's both. But yeah. Methoda says, that sounds like weapons grade copium. I couldn't beat Cuphead because it was too accessible. No, it's because it wasn't accessible enough for me. There was something about the control schemes that I just didn't like, and it just didn't feel good for me to play it. So it was kind of the opposite issue.
Just too many of us, and we're too different for there to even be a chance. With that said, I think one of the best things developers can do is to make it clear to players what the intended experience is supposed to feel like. When they communicate their intentions, explain how different settings will impact the core experience, and at the very least give more specific descriptions than it's going to be hard, it goes a long way with helping players figure out what will make sense for them. This is easier said than done for certain titles, as some games have pretty flexible intended experiences, but even then, the more the player knows, the easier it will be for them to choose what to go with. Personally, my favorite approach is when a game...
Oh yeah, sorry, man, I feel so bad for pausing so often. So, one example of a game where I felt like the difficulty was a joke and wasn't actually difficult was Final Fantasy 16. And I literally have the footage on my computer of going into like the final battle, and the God of War style quick time event where you need to press square to like parry what the enemy is doing. I literally input 0 commands for the entirety of the beginning of like the kaiju boss fight type thing, and it didn't matter. I still, successfully completed it. Well, that's a lie. I did have to input commands at the very end to certain sequences to progress them, but like the quickly tap R1 type thing, it makes it seem as though you have to like mash it in order to win the like the stalemate, deadlock, whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't matter. You could wait 5 minutes and the R1 thing will still be flashing on screen. So you just need to press R1 enough times and it goes through. So it's kind of an interesting thing because like obviously you're designed to win the game, but the game provides enough pressure and tension that most players aren't going to realize that it's rigged for them in their favor anyway. So I don't really fault the devs for doing it because it feels good to do it the intended way. Like, oh man, you're really like in the heat of it. You're pressing R1 as quickly as possible, even if it doesn't matter, because no matter the player's speed of pressing R1, they'll still get the final goal of like getting the pretty colors of, their kaiju boss fight. So that's kind of a good thing. But once you pull the curtain back and reveal the wizard, it definitely leaves a bit more to be desired, I feel. I don't know. I don't know if there's like a better solution for it. So it's definitely accessible, but yeah. Yeah, literally fake quick time events. Indeed. Unironic true slow time events. Yeah. Somebody should record them making a coffee during that. I think there literally was I'm sure there are multiple reviews of people doing that, but I remember distinctly seeing a review of Final Fantasy 16 where it was a joke about that they didn't even really play the game. They just kind of like watched a movie. And so they would like pick up the controller for like 30 seconds and then like the frame would cut. And then the next thing you know, they're just like, they have the controller set down. Both feet are like up on the couch. They're cradling a mug of coffee or like hot chocolate in both of their hands and like sipping it as like the game is talking at them. So that's definitely been done before. Video game for Tesla drivers. Oh man. True and real. Stella says, the only hard time you've ever had with QuickTime events is in the hard modes for Bayonetta. The time window is awful with bad reaction time. Yeah, okay. I think like Final Fantasy VIII, in a certain sense, kind of also had those, because you could use the boost function with their Guardian Force things to increase the damage that your summon would do if you pressed the square button or whatnot at the right time. I remember as a kid, I had a turbo controller, so I would do it, but even with a turbo controller, it's kind of actually a fun mini game because there'd be periodic points where you shouldn't press the boost button because it would reset you all the way back down to 0. So it's kind of fun trying to hold down the square button to boost it up properly, and not so much so that I would hit the overflow window and go back down to 0. So looking back at it, it would probably have been better if they like removed the turbo aspect of it and just made it hold down square to boost it, because that's essentially what I did. And most players wouldn't be able to get to like 255 max boost on every summon because a lot of the summon windows were like really short for their cutscenes. Anyway, not really important. Mortis's favorite is the one in God of War Ragnarok. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that in case it's a spoiler. Bayo1 is probably the worst. Okay, thanks for the comments, guys.
Presents itself as having a single set difficulty, but whether it be through an assist mode or the accessibility options, also offers ways to shift things for those who need it. This approach makes it clear what the experience is supposed to be and challenges players of all skill levels to engage with it, but it gives people the ability to choose how they want to play if something is just a bit off for them. When presented in this way, players will be less likely to use it on a whim and largely only turn to it when the alternative is quitting altogether. Of course, this approach has problems too. Like I said, they all do. It's impossible for things to not be a bit messy. Life is unbalanced, and so there will always be flaws with the difficulty of a game, and unfortunately that will get in the way of us being able to enjoy them at times. All we can really do is gravitate towards the approaches that bother us the least, and hope that nothing too annoying gets in our way.
You ready to
Why
die?
does your mic sound so bad?
Why do you care?
I'm the one who has to listen to it. You should think about getting something better like the mod mic. Ask me about the mod mic.
What's the mod?
The mod mic is a wireless microphone that can be attached to pretty much any pair of headphones. Personally, I've never been able to find a headset that gets great sound from both its microphone and headphones, so when Antlion Audio reached out to me about the mod mic, I was excited to give it a shot, and it's been awesome. Not only does it sound great, it's what I'm using to record this right now, but it's also super versatile, as it can be attached to any flat surface, whether that be your nice pair of studio headphones, or a VR headset, or even a paper bag. This is part of me now. It connects to your computer through Bluetooth, and setting it up is as easy as plugging in the receiver. As for its other features, it has two modes, one for getting the highest quality sound as possible, and the other for canceling out room noise for those in louder environments. On top of that, it has a 12-hour battery life and a 2-year warranty, so in all ways, you're covered for a long time. It's the perfect mic for chatting with friends or streaming, and essentially lets you create your ideal headset by attaching it to whatever you like to use. And if you're more of an in-ear headset kind of person, Antlion has an option for that too with its Kimura line, which also sounds great and has a fair bit of versatility as well, as the microphone can be used with most standard 2-pin or MMCX in-ear monitors. So whatever your needs are, there's a good chance Antlion has something for you. Both of these options give a significant amount of bang for your buck, so if you're looking for an incredible headset microphone without breaking the bank, check them out. Just go to the link in the description and find what works best
Is
for
that
you.
Wayland logo from Alien? I have no idea.
Can I kill you now?
Oh yeah, go for it. Anyway, thanks to Antlion for sponsoring this video. For all of you still here, hi! I'd like to thank my patrons for making this channel possible and give a special shout out to Victor Duva for being an honorary Bag Butin. That's it. Have a great day and or night, and I'll see you in the next one.
What rings you got? Alright, that was a really good video. He brought up many points in ways that I think I would have struggled to come up with myself or consider, just because it is such a nuanced topic, and he brought a lot of interesting perspectives to it, which I'm like struggling to think of right now. So I did want to touch on one more thing that he said towards the end there before like the ad and everything. Oh, right. So it did feel like a little bit of a flatter ending than I would have liked, in that, oh, there's this issue with difficulty and nothing can be done. That just kind of felt like a little bit of a sour note to me. I think of all the things that he talked about, there can be a push for a movement for developers who do include difficulty settings in their games to label how their difficulty sliders are going to affect things. Like, what is the quote-unquote intended experience? It is always welcome for the devs to include that. And then the other thing I think a lot of games could be improved by like having the adjusting difficulty is putting those sliders behind like perhaps new game plus progress or certain story progress or certain mechanical check marks to get to that. So let's say that you want like harder content. Maybe there's a certain boss you need to defeat or a certain stage or level you need to clear before you can unlock that mode. And I know like a lot of the older games had like their whole cheat menus. I think those things should make a comeback. They always felt really like nice little Easter eggs when I discovered those as a kid, and I'm kind of like nostalgic about that kind of thing, and they were just always really nice to me. So anyway, that was a fantastic video. I'm gonna probably subscribe. I'm gonna look at what else he's made first. What are games are like for somebody who doesn't play games? Open worlds don't matter. All right, this definitely sounds clickbaity enough that I'm gonna give Rasputin a sub. That was my first video by them, and all right, I've already linked it into the chat if you guys want to give him a like and sub as well. So I just subbed. All right. I can't milk you for microtransactions if you just have cheat codes. You got me. You got me. Well, you see, you put the cheat codes behind the microtransactions, and then I got you, right? All right, hey you, thanks for dropping in, and hopefully you have a swift and stellar recovery from the Rona. Happy New Year. All right. So those were two very good videos about difficulty. I feel like we've definitely hashed out the topic now, so I'm glad we had both back to back. So next, we will transition into some lore with Dark Souls 2, essentially, with The Fate of the Forlorn by Honored Madman. I always love Shanalot kicking her feet. Oh, is this a little bit odd for you guys? I'll turn it down slightly.
Have you just arrived? How very unusual. Just how long has
I'll turn it
been?
back up.
Rejoice, my new friend. For this is a true haven of the Forlorn, the cold and gentle painted world of Ariandel. Quick, go along. Find one for yourself. A sweetly rotting bed to lie upon.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. Today's episode is going to be about something Dark Souls 2 related yet again. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Forlorn and just what they are and what became of them after the events of Dark Souls 2. And since there isn't a whole lot of written lore about these guys, we're going to have to do a fair amount of speculation to draw some conclusions when it comes to where they ended up. But let's start with what is known about these guys. Or should I say girls, because you know, every Forlorn character model is actually a female. Now, if you played Scholar of the First Sin, you're more than acquainted with the Forlorn. I mean, they're on the game's cover art. And despite not appearing in the flesh, they appear as enemy invaders at multiple points throughout the story. And they make pretty formidable opponents, too. They wield great scythes or swords that look suspiciously close to the weapons of dark wraiths, and they have a habit of invading at the worst moments. But who are they, and what exactly have they become? What was done to them, and who did it? Well, originally I like to believe that they were just like us, the player, a cursed.
So yeah, Scaleezy asks, does Majula qualify as a liminal space? I think pretty much everything in DS2 does, because it's kind of contingent on it all being gotten through a liminal space with the vortex in the water. So sure. And then Mortis likes the Forlorn because they're kind of like an addendum since they're a Scholar of the First Sin edition. Yeah. Methoda asks, do we think those sweetly rotting beds are actually comfortable? He's speaking fondly, so they must be soft and squishy. If you've ever seen like moss, it definitely looks comfortable. I've never just like laid down on a bed of moss, but I can imagine if it feels as comfortable as it looks, it must be quite nice if you can get over the dampness and the squishiness. I don't know.
First undead wandering the lands of Drenlake in search of a cure. That is, until our favorite mad scientist, Aldia, got a hold of them. So Aldia was the king of Drenlake's older brother, who became obsessed with figuring out the secrets of life. And to this end he conducted numerous horrific scientific experiments on the various creatures and people found in Drenlake and abroad. He even invited several foreigners to come visit him, and they were quietly, disappeared and secreted away. And
Yeah, and that's a pretty good assessment right there that Aldia was studying life. I know a lot of people just kind of like miss that part of him because it's like kind of indirect, I think, of like 2 or 3 items or it's like one variation of one item specifically that's like part of a set.
Turned into abominations. And not to mention his brother Vendrick's war with the Giants provided him with a whole new slew of test subjects, the Giants themselves. And yeah, to say he got weird with it would be an understatement, but he did succeed in resurrecting an ancient dragon with the Giant Souls. He also presumably created the Emerald Herald, who helps us level up and guides us through the game, presumably in an effort to guide someone to finish the work he started because, he failed and turned himself into a flaming bonfire tree thing. So while his work did produce some pretty amazing results, it's also worth remembering that almost all the messed up shit you see in the game can trace its roots back to Aldia's research. I mean, him and his acolytes have basically dissected just about everything that walks Drenlake more than once from the looks of it. But that's a story for
Yeah, that's a pretty good point that a lot of the issues can kind of be directly attributed to Aldia in some form or another. Obviously, I mean, not all of them, because much of the issues stem from the undead curse to begin with. So Aldia is trying to stymie that in its influence, and in so doing, the whole world kind of fell apart. But it's gonna kind of fall apart whether or not Aldia did his thing, so uh yeah, can you really blame him? Aldi is a monster, literally and figuratively. Scowleys said you managed to get an OG copy of DS2 for the 360 a couple years ago, so somehow you missed all the Scholar of the First Sin issues. That's interesting. Two Hit Good, who's been in chat, has been streaming periodically, not so much lately, which I don't really blame him. A vanilla and Scholar of the First Sin comparison run of the games, and kind of lost the will to play Scholar of the First Sin from what he's been saying, which I don't blame him.
For another day, and that will probably happen because Aldia is one of my favorite characters, but we're here to talk about the Forlorn. So what exactly did Aldia do to them to make them forlorn? Legend says that they were born of Aldia's obsession with the first sin. You know, Gwyn's branding of humanity with the dark side and tying their fates to the fire and whatnot, which is not unlike most of his experiments, but what does that mean? Well, it's hard to tell exactly what he did, but it appears that Aldia and his buddies have managed to sever these individuals from their home world, or perhaps their home world was lost to them due to the experimentation, which also resulted in them losing their human forms as well, as they only...
So there's a little bit more to that, and I'll go into detail if he doesn't do it right here. Hey Paul, welcome into the stream. Are the changes in Scholar that bad? Jeez. Yes. You haven't played it yet? It'd be an interesting experience if you do.
only are able to...
Oops. So yeah, Scholar brings in some good things, but also some not so great things as well.
exist as phantoms now. They effectively exist in a sort of transient state, forever drifting from world to world in search of a new home. It's tough to say what Aldia learned about circumventing the curse of the undead through his experimentations with the Forlorn, but it's probably safe to assume that they were discarded as failures. And as far as the part they play in the game goes, after the Lost Bastille, they effectively take over for the Pursuer as the player's main rival throughout the rest of the game. Generally,
Alright, so aside from severing them from their homelands, there's a little bit more that goes into that with the Forlorn, because you could make the argument that the Forlorn should have already been severed from their homelands once they become undead. So what I believe Aldia did was he separated the Forlorn from the bonfires specifically. So because the Forlorn lost their bonfire connection, they lost their connection to home, which is more or less insinuated in items like Homeward or something like that. I don't remember like a lot of the DS2 descriptions specifically. It also doesn't really help that the game, there's 3 games, so the items get repeated, and I don't remember which version corresponds to what. So what's the word? Homeward? Okay, so I think it might be in Dark Souls 1 or 3 then. So in Dark Souls 2, it's a little bit different. The curse slowly erodes one's memory until even one's birthplace is reduced to a figment of a clouded past, but the bonfires are constant, a beacon for the tragically afflicted. So I think it's in DS1 where it's a bit more... Is this actually DS1? Okay, yeah. Okay, so DS1 Homeward would normally link to one's homeland. Only the curse of the undead has distorted its power, redirecting casters to a bonfire. Or perhaps for undead, this serves as home. Which is kind of cool that, in a certain sense, Dark Souls 2 builds on the framework of Dark Souls 1, but it is also a little bit frustrating if you're only working with Dark Souls 2 to need to refer back to material that isn't in that game specifically. But that's kind of neither here nor there. But anyway, the important thing is, even though this is written as a little bit of a hearsay, this is something that I just kind of take as something we need to deal with at face value, because we don't really have like a lot of alternatives to contradict it. So for the undead, they've lost their homeland, and now the bonfire serve as home. And so, for the Forlorn to lose their homes, they would need to lose their connection to a bonfire. And if they lose their connection to the bonfire, they just kind of float in between worlds, essentially. So, just kind of building off of what Honored Madman has been saying here. So DS3's Homeward says something similar? Okay, let me look at that one. And I do feel as though it is like a little bit bad to rely on the later games to give more context to DS2 and like DS1, but sometimes that's just how it is. Okay, no, so it's the same one, except for whatever reason the English here doesn't use the question mark, although it's definitely demarcated as a question in Japanese. So it's pretty much the exact same description. Thank you. Okay.
Really hounding them at numerous inopportune moments. Now, yeah, that's a pretty small role in the game considering they got the whole cover art treatment, but I think it's understandable. I mean, they have really cool armor. I like it a little bit better than the Farum set, which I'm already a pretty big fan of. But what became of the Forlorn after Dark Souls 2? Well, this is where we start getting into heavy speculation, my favorite, because they don't physically appear in Dark Souls 3, not even their armor set made it into the game. But just like we can...
It's because they got lost. But yeah, I also wanted to welcome back in Special Noob to the stream. Nice to have you again. Thank you.
Assume that the mannequins of Dark Souls 2 were absorbed into Londor's Sable Church based on the Pale Shade's mask and weapons, as well as Uria's own mask. We can make some similar assumptions regarding the Forlorn. Now, I know we can all think of a place where the unwanted go, a sort of island of broken toys sort of place. I'm of course referring to the Painted World. It first appeared in Dark Souls 1 full of crow demons and being watched over by a half-dragon, half-goddess woman wielding a frozen scythe. We learn a little bit more about the Painted World in Dark Souls 3. For example, we now know that when each painting begins to rot, it's burned away and a new painting is created and the inhabitants now move into that. Now, when we first meet Gale in Dark Souls 3, he's praying to somebody. Now, I'm not entirely sure who exactly he's praying to, but it could be Keitha, the goddess of tears, often associated with the Way of White, who, Gale, he throws those Way of White discs and was trained in its clerical ways, at least in some way. And also the place he's praying, the Cathedral of the Deep, used to be a Way of the White temple. Alternatively, he could be praying to Velka, the goddess of sin, mother of all the crow demons. And I like to think this one's also pretty possible just based on the Painted World's association with the crows. But whoever she is, he refers to her as the Mother of the Forlorn. And the word Forlorn specifically is capitalized. And that started to get me thinking, what if the Forlorn of Dark Souls 2 found their way into the Painted World?
All right. Time to look it up. I will need to make a note of that. So you Special Noob finally beat Lords of the Fallen, so now you're able to move on. Nice. How did you enjoy the game, if you don't mind me asking, or not enjoy it? So who am I looking up? Gale in Dark Souls 3. Okay. Forlorn. Imi Monotachi. So yeah, I wish I had like the full search feature so I could like look really quickly amongst the games. Imi Monotachi. I feel like the Forlorn and Dark Souls 2 are referred to differently. Forl. Okay. Yep, that it's a little bit different. Soshitsumono. Okay. So in Dark Souls 2, the Forlorn are called Soshitsumono, which is like the lost people, people who've lost something. And in 3, wait, no, this is not it. And in 3, Gale calls the Mother of the Forlorn like the Imimono Tachi no Haha. So Imimono, it's really hard to translate this directly, but as far as like the Omen are concerned, in Elden Ring they're called Imi. So like the Imi Oni is like the Demon Prince Margit, or Omen Prince Margit, I guess is what the localization calls them. But like the Imi Oni is like a demon, like an ogre type thing. But anyway, not too important. So could the Forlorn still be the same ones? Maybe. because like thematically they would fit, but at the very least the terminology is slightly different here. So
And that would be the perfect place for them to call home. It was a place for the unwanted and unneeded beings of the universe to exist quietly and peacefully out of sight from the rest of the world. But how would they find their way there? I mean, there was no trace of the painting itself within Dark Souls 2. We even see the only crow demon in the game, Weaponsmith Ornifex, has crafted a great deal of dolls that sort of resemble the peculiar doll that you need to enter the painting in the first game, in what appears to be some attempt to get back to the painted world. Now, we don't know if she's had any success in this regard. I mean, it's entirely possible that all of her dolls work and she's crafting them for the forlorn souls she encounters in her travels in Dranlaic so that she can send them back to the painting. That's definitely a possibility, and if that was the case, perhaps she encountered some forlorn, understood their nature, and sort of gave them a doll and sent them on their way. And we know the painting itself withstood the test of time as it appears in the flesh in Dark Souls 3, albeit in a rotten scrap-like form. But if the forlorn did escape into the painting, where are they at by the events of Dark Souls 3? Well, several cycles have passed, and the changed world, like the outside world, has changed a whole hell of a lot. Specifically, it's got a whole bunch of new inhabitants, and possibly some changed ones. We see a lot of these beings known as the Corvians. They're basically like humanoid bird people. Some have more human features, and some have more bird features. Now, the ones that I'm referring to as having more human features can do this shriek that grants them wings and a whole hell of a lot more bird features, but generally they just look like a feathered hollow. Now, I believe both of the subspecies of Corvian all descended from the crow demons of Dark Souls 1, at least in some way. I think those taller, more humanoid ones are what became of the Forlorn, like their final results, if you will. See, due to Aldia's experimentation, these guys lost their human form. They don't really...
So, was he saying that the original Corvians were the byproduct of the Forlorn? I could potentially see the Dark Souls 3 ones being like that, but the first ones I would be skeptical of, because they should predate all these experiments.
Really have bodies, and I think it's possible that maybe they became devout servants of Velka, and perhaps they and their descendants all changed into more crow-like beings, possessing the ability to fully turn into a crow if threatened. I mean, it's also possible that the Forlorn interbred with some of the crow demons, and this was the result, and that all of the more bird-like ones found in the painted world are sort of just the natural evolution of the crow demons when a painting is left to rot. Well, with the exception of the Corvian Knights, I mean, they seem to have been uplifted and given almost Dark Wraith-style armor, which does line up with who they serve. I mean, Fried was a former member of the Sable Church. She was probably also a devout disciple of Darkstalker Koth. But then when she found the painted world and Priscilla was no longer around to guide them, she saw that all she would need to do was fill the void that Priscilla had left and wield a scythe while walking around barefoot, and they would revere her as their leader, and that worked. It's almost like what you do in the Shivering Isles DLC for Oblivion. You sort of get the symbols of office and become the god, for lack of a better word, of your own little dimension. And that's exactly what Sister Fried did. But yeah, I think that the Forlorn's possible transformation into the Corvians has to have at least had something to do with the fact that they lacked actual corporeal forms, and that maybe life as Corvians was the best thing that Velka could do for them, or again was the result of interspecies relations. Now, I do think it would have been nice.
Yeah, I think those are interesting ideas, but they're just a little bit too far for the text from the text for me to be fully on board with there.
For FromSoftware to have just thrown the Forlorn set somewhere into the Ashes of Ariandel expansion, but you can't always get what you want, I guess. I mean, even with the Corvian Knights, yeah, it makes sense for their armor to resemble that of the Dark Wraith armor, but I think it's almost too obvious. Like, that's literally Abyss Forged armor. It would have made a lot more sense for them to have been wearing Forlorn armor, or at least some kind of evolution of it, perhaps with a beaked helmet, because the original set didn't even have a helmet, it just had a hood. But in short, I believe the Forlorn found their way to the painted world, perhaps with the help of Weapon Shaper Ornifex, and over the course of several cycles they slowly became a subspecies of Corvian, a crow-like race of bird people that's forever watched over by the goddess of sin, Velka. Not exactly pretty sights, but at least in this theory, these sad results of a mad scientist's experimentation, actual, real-life, tortured souls, wandering spirit type of guys, finally got a home to call their own. That's about as happy of an ending you're going to find in Dark Souls. I mean, yeah, their home did.
So yeah, I like that idea in general, that if the Forlorn, in Dark Souls 2 were forlorn and didn't have a home, in many ways it does make a lot of sense for them to have winded up in the painting. So whether or not they become Corvians is of course like open to interpretation, which I'm perfectly fine with. And there isn't a lot of textual support for it, but it is plausible enough to a degree where I'm not going to like completely rule out the idea. So, special noob switched to the Light Reaper swords and Lords of the Fallen, and that did make combat a bit better, and they'll still give it a 6.5 out of 10. The story areas seem too disjointed from each other, and the connections between Adir and the Umber Lamp seem unfinished. Also, every ending is openly hopeless. Is an openly hopeless end. Yeah. So yeah, I enjoyed Lords of the Fallen. I think as far as like the gameplay mechanics go, it's a pretty solid game, but it has some like systemic issues holding it back. Forlorn, yeah. Yeah, he's just spitballing, so it's just a fun thought experiment. And yeah, that's true as well. And I also do give Honored Madman credit for being very clear that this stuff is speculation, because not everybody is clear about that. And I do think it's important to note when you're doing that. So yeah, like I said, I appreciate this, even if, you know, I can't be fully on board with it. I just, yeah, it's all good.
Did sort of get usurped by a member of the Sable Church, but that's a story for another day. But it's still really annoying that there was no Forlorn set in Dark Souls 3, especially in a DLC that uses the word Forlorn so much. And there was so many chances they could have even had a Forlorn invader just pop up as a reference to Dark Souls 2. I mean,
And yeah, this is one of those unfortunate things about localization where if you're not super careful about what terms were used between the games, you can run into issues like this, where Forlorn might make sense for like Imimono, because like an Imiko can be a child that is like a bastard and kind of has no parents in a sense and is sort of homeless, if not like literally, figuratively. And so I can definitely understand calling these guys Forlorn, because it's a real pain trying to translate that word specifically, because you're just not going to get a lot of the proper nuances across there. So as far as the localization of Imimono, Forlorn is pretty good depending on like the context. So it's a little bit unfortunate that Forlorn may have been used for the Soshitsumono of Dark Souls 2, like those who've lost their beginnings or like homes. So yeah, Forlorn works for both of them, but by using Forlorn for both of them, it just kind of ends up where they like step on each other's toes, especially when there are a lot of thematic overlaps between them beyond just the name. Is FromSoft still using Frog Nation for translation? As far as I know, yes. They definitely use them for Elden Ring. Lost One seems like a better translation for the DS2 Forlorn. Maybe. Yeah, it just, no matter what you choose at times, it just kind of opens up some possibilities and closes off others, and that's just kind of how it goes. You think after all this time they'd be better at translation? I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. Like a lot, I mean, most of the translations are fine. It's just sometimes like the schedules are so tight that you don't have enough time to go back and tighten things up as much as you'd like. Sometimes the text gets revised in the Japanese and doesn't come back to the translation team to get like fixed later. And then other times you need to know like every single description in the previous game and like every little keyword in the previous game. And it just takes a lot of time and familiarity to be able to do that. And time is a luxury and time is money. So what you go and do? Just rely on scrubs like me on the YouTubes to point out these errors, I suppose.
They had Earthen Peak and the Desert Pyromancer for seemingly no reason in Ringed City, and I absolutely loved those references. That's probably one of my favorite things about the Ringed City, was going through the Dreg Heap the first time and seeing Earthen Peak and a literal hot Pyromancer. And I mean, you'd think
some other Earthen Peaks. No wonder he was such a fan.
the literal cover mascot for Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin would get some kind of similar treatment. I don't know, it just seems like a pretty big missed opportunity, and I'm one of the people who actually really did like Ashes of Ariandel. I know it kind of gets a bad rap, but I'm a lore guy. I liked the additional lore that it provided. I mean, it's not as good as the Ring City, but I still appreciate it a lot. But yeah, at the risk of continuing that ramble, that was pretty much all I had to say about that, so let's have our outro and then a couple of final thoughts, and
Yeah, I think with Ashes of Ariandel, some of the issues are that it's fairly small and fairly self-contained, and it just kind of gets outshined by the Ringed City promising so much more and kind of delivering, and being the end cap of, or end cap, whatever, of like the series, and just kind of like giving a lot more finality to the players, and that Ashes of Ariandel could never hope to provide. So it just kind of gets overshadowed in a lot of ways because of that. But I don't necessarily think it's a bad DLC. It's just there's better DLC, so it's bad in comparison, but not really bad. I do really enjoy the Sister Frida and Father Ariandel fight, and this DLC probably could have been improved if there is another fight that was not the champion Gravetender. Mortis says they've gotten better at correcting errors. They did fix the translation error in one of the Great Rune descriptions on what it did. I don't remember that one specifically, but the one that stands out the most to me is retconning the Dusk-Eyed Queen, so it's only the Gloam-Eyed Queen now. Scowlazy says, also there's not much reason to play it, question mark. The gear and rewards aren't worth it usually. There's a couple things, so if you want like the Black Flame stuff from like Sister Frida, that's a really good motivation to do it. But yeah, you're kind of right that there isn't like anything like super cool and compelling to grab here specifically. There's 2 Titanite slabs and 2 chunks. Frida Scythe is super niche. Same with the Rose of Ariandel, as well as like the Corvian fan thing, which I can't remember what it's called, but you know what I mean. Like the Corvian weapons are really cool, but yeah, you're kind of right there that there's like not a lot to spice up the base game. Whereas like with the Ring City, you at least have like the Covenant thing, and you could like use the like little projectiles from that at the least, no matter kind of your build. It was the one where it did something with HP, but the description said it did something else with HP. Thanks, Mortis. Yeah, I just don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sure I could probably like compare it to the 1.0 description and figure it out though. Oh yeah, and sometimes like things like that happen. I think it's like the full moon crossbow, or one of the crossbows in Elden Ring says it scales on faith, but it definitely scales on magic, or it's the other way around, something like that. Scowlazy just does the DLC to dip in and grab the upgrade materials and get to +7 early. Yeah, that's true.
So what's coming next? So yeah, as always, I hope you guys found the video at least to be somewhat informative, somewhat amusing. If you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. If you like hearing me ramble on about various video game characters ranging from the FromSoftware universe to the Elder Scrolls universe to Legend of Zelda, you know, etc., then consider subscribing to the channel. We're always doing fun video ideas. The next one should be up soon. It's probably going to be about a certain giant that we befriend along the way in Dark Souls 3, but stay tuned to find out who. But as always, be safe, and I will see you next time.
Merciful Goddess, Mother of the Forlorn, who have no place to call their own, please bear witness to our resolve.
Alright, so that was a pretty good video. For the most part, it was grounded, and the parts where it wasn't as grounded, Honored Madman was very clear about what was speculation, which I give big kudos for that. So I appreciate that. And I did enjoy the video, so I'm going to go ahead and like it. So obviously some of the issues with this video were partly due to translation or localization, where the term Forlorn was reused between the games, but it might not refer to them the exact same way. Now, to be fair, I haven't double checked like every description, and there could still be an overlapping, but from like the very preliminary direct quotes used so far, there is that little bit of inconclusivity that you just kind of hate to see. So anyway, yeah. I'm going to go ahead and link his video into chat. It's right there if you guys want it. What does that bubbling mean, LP? It means he is brewing a magic potion. That's what it means. You know what it means. Does the Ring City DLC have any hints how patches got from Dark Souls to Elden Ring? Yeah, so when you go down to the Ringed City, you're likely to start a bonfire, and bonfires scare away insects. And because Patches was a spider in Bloodborne, he got scared, so his head came out of the spider body, and it grew into his real body. But that process took so much out of him, he kind of ended up becoming hollow, and that's how come he became Lap, I guess. Oh, you said from Dark Souls to Elden Ring. Just picture another joke that I failed to deliver. Is it not the same patches in DS3 and Elden Ring? They seem completely the same. I think it's just more like a gimmick thing. So I don't think it's supposed to be like the same individual, because he does literally become a spider in Bloodborne. I could get someone to believe that if you're not careful. You're not wrong. All right. So that was it with the honored. I almost said Monard Hadman. The Honored Madman video. And we don't really have enough time to get into the next video with the irony of Gideon the All-Knowing with Miss Chalice, or the 8-bit music theory. So we'll probably end slightly early again tonight. And we'll probably pick it up tomorrow, maybe with the Gideon the All-Knowing or something else. And, probably get through these next two videos at the very least tomorrow. So I'll figure out the schedule. Hope you guys stay safe, and join me again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Till then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.